I would like to call this hearing to order this morning, and certainly want to welcome our panel of witnesses, and also want to welcome all the members back on the subcommittee. I look forward to another 2 years with the ranking member, Mr. Rush. And also, we're really excited to have 3 new members on the Republican side joining our subcommittee for the first time, Mr. Latta of Ohio, and Mr. Cassidy of Louisiana, and also Mr. Kinsinger of Illinois. We are delighted that they're on this subcommittee and look forward to working with them on important issues facing our nation in the energy sector, as well as all of the members of the subcommittee, Democrat and Republican. The title of today's hearing is American Energy Security and Innovation, and we're going to focus on an assessment of North America's energy resources. I think all of us agree that we have many problems facing our country today, but one of the primary ones that we have is a sluggish economy. And we want to be sure that we take every action possible to stimulate the economy and create more jobs. Certainly, we're very much aware in the last quarter, our GDP decreased by 0.1%. Our unemployment rate has ticked up from 7.8 to 7.9%. And so we all face this challenge of adopting policies and taking actions that can help stimulate the economy. Certainly, one of the primary factors that affects the economy is energy policy. And certainly there are other factors as well, but that plays a vital role. I was reminded as I read the testimony last night that it wasn't too many years ago when people throughout the country, experts and otherwise, were talking about how the U.S. Fossil fuels, for example, their resources were being depleted. We were running out of oil, we were running out of natural gas, and we're going to have to be importing more. As a matter of fact, in January 2007, a CEO of one of our largest utility companies made the comment that that we were running out of natural gas, production was declining and demand growing, so he expected that imports would go from 3% of our national needs to 24% in 2020. And then, of course, we know what has happened. We've had all sorts of new discoveries, the Bakken Field, the Eagle Ford, developments in Colorado. And most of these shale fields have been discovered on private lands. And even though the number of permits on public lands has gone down, the production on private lands has increased dramatically. So this is a real game changer, the possibility of a game changer in America. We've heard the term for many, many years. We have that opportunity to be energy independent. And that is actually the reality today. And I tell you what, people around the world are focused on it too, because some of our witnesses today attended the World Economic Forum in Davos. And we know that many the Europeans are expressing great concern about the abundance of energy that we have in America and their ability to compete in the global marketplace, because their energy costs are going up in Europe. And we have the opportunity to decrease our energy costs because of this abundance of fossil fuel that we have. Now, we all recognize that we have renewables that can play a role as well, but I'm not going to be an alarmist about the increased use of fossil fuel, because our carbon dioxide emissions today are lower than they've been in America in 20 years, which shows that the marketplace can continue to play a vital role. Our expertise in technology continues to improve, and so in oil, in natural gas, and in coal, we have abundant resources that can meet the needs of this country on the electricity side and the transportation side for years and years to come. So we have a unique opportunity, and the policies that we adopt at the government level will determine whether or not we're going to be successful in America. And some of the policies, there's a lot of disagreement on this committee about how aggressive EPA should be. I was reading some court decisions over the last a couple of weeks. There were a total of 8 of them in which the court language was very strong in chastising EPA for being overly aggressive and exceeding their legal authority. And yet they have had good policies as well, and America does not have to take a back seat to anyone, to any country, for our enforcement of environmental laws. But our objective is we want a balanced approach. We don't want to be an alarmist on climate change, for example, but we want to protect our environment, and we want to fully explore the natural resources that we have, which can go a long way stimulating our economy and creating jobs for Americans. With that, at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I certainly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I also want to join you in welcoming all the members of the new members of the subcommittee and those who are returning. And I want to especially welcome the new members on the Democratic side, Mr. McNerney, Mr. Tonko, Mr. Barrow, Ms. McSuey, and Ms. Christensen to this subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding today's hearing assessing North America's energy resources. As we began the subcommittee's work for the 113th Congress, I would submit that it is critical for us as policymakers to understand the changing landscape of our nation's energy supplies. Not only as we move away from policies guided by scarcity, but also so that we can develop a comprehensive energy plan for moving this nation forward. This subcommittee needs to get down to the serious business of enacting an energy blueprint that will move this country towards a truly all-of-the-above strategy that will follow 4 basic principles. 1, to provide safe, reliable, and affordable energy to all Americans. 2, to provide additional jobs and economic opportunities to all segments of our population. 3, a plan that will address the dire consequences of climate change that scientists have been warning us about for years now, and which we have been seeing more and more of firsthand evidence and evidences across this nation. And 4th, to set a path that would help us become self-sufficient and energy independent over the next few decades. Mr. Chairman, today we will hear from our expert witnesses that domestic crude oil production has increased significantly over the past few years, with the EIA reporting that U.S. crude oil production has increased from 5.1 million barrels per day in 2007 to 6.4 million barrels per day in 2012, the highest level since 1997. The EIA reports that in 2005, the U.S. imported 60% of the petroleum it consumed, and by 2012, that number had dropped to about 41%, the lowest level in decades. This decline can be attributed primarily to increased domestic oil production, the additional use of biofuels, as well as the adoption of higher fuel efficiency standards for vehicles. The IEA also projects that the U.S. will reduce its reliance on imported oil to less than 30% of consumption by 2035. And U.S. natural gas production will increase by 44% by 2040, due primarily to the projected growth in shale gas production. However, Mr. Chairman, in order to reach all the necessary objectives of providing reliable energy, creating new jobs, addressing climate change, and also becoming energy independent, it is imperative for this subcommittee to also promote and to encourage renewable energy resources. The NREL estimates that we can supply 80% of total U.S. electricity generation from renewable energy generation through technologies that are commercially available by the year 2050. Mr. Chairman, I welcome today's hearing, and as we move legislatively, I would urge this subcommittee to promote a truly all-of-the-above energy policy that includes renewables and clean energy sources, as well as traditional carbon-intensive fossil fuels before the time is too late, Mr. Chairman, too late to act. We thank you, and I really look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. We appreciate that opening statement. At this time, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly this hearing is a welcome one to examine the positive developments resulting from advancements in innovation and technology, the game-changing potential for North American energy independence. What was once believed to be unthinkable is certainly now within our grasp. For 30 years, the American people have been told that we are a nation of declining resources at the mercy of OPEC. The story was nearly as gloomy with natural gas, with forecasts of dwindling domestic supplies, higher prices, rising imports from the Middle East. In fact, in this committee, many may remember when we crafted a new title in the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to facilitate what we thought would be the new norm: pending reliance on imported gas from geopolitically unstable regions of the world to add to our growing reliance on OPEC oil. What a bad thing. But thanks to the American ingenuity and advanced technologies, the trends in domestic oil and natural gas production have in fact been turned upside down. In fact, the U.S. is now the world's leading producer of natural gas, and the IEA is predicting that by 2020, U.S. oil production will exceed Saudi Arabia. 2020, let me repeat that, we're going to exceed the production in Saudi Arabia. Our overall energy landscape has changed dramatically in just a short period of time, and it is not only rewriting the economic outlook that we have as a nation, but also beginning to change the geopolitical nature of global energy economics. Today, this subcommittee is launching a series of hearings on energy security and innovation to hear from experts who are working with the current realities. It's up to us to ensure that our federal laws are not continuing to introduce roadblock after roadblock to enhance energy security. We've got to remain steadfast in our support for efforts to improve the infrastructure necessary to maximize use of these resources, including the Keystone XL pipeline. These issues are too important for our nation to be looked at in a vacuum, and if we don't take advantage of our energy abundance, other nations are eagerly waiting to step in and use the North American energy to fuel their own growth. The benefits of emerging energy abundance are many: boosting our economy and creating jobs across the country, a bright spot in the economic downturn. We've got to build upon that progress. Once we have a more accurate sense of North America's energy potential, we can start the process of ensuring that we have a proper vision for the future. And I yield the balance of my time to anybody? Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want the record to show that I have my iPad, and I am trying to do this electronically. So I'm at least trying. I want to welcome our witnesses. I see former Congressman Martin Frost out in the audience. He knows a little bit about energy. We're glad to have you here, Martin. Today's an important hearing, Mr. Chairman. I represent a congressional district in Texas that at one time, had it been a nation, would have been the fifth largest oil-producing nation in the world. The first oil field west of the Mississippi was discovered in my congressional district at Corsicana in 1895. As we speak today in the Barnett Shale, which is not totally in my congressional district, there are over 16,000 producing natural gas wells, and last year they produced in the neighborhood of 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in that one field. With the miracle of hydraulic fracturing, we have unleashed a drilling and production revolution in this country, not only in natural gas, but now that technology is being used in oil. And the state of North Dakota, which less than 10 years ago had probably fewer than 200 or 300 oil wells, is on track in that one state to produce over 1 million barrels of oil in the very near future, possibly this year. We can be energy independent if we want to. It's not a question of can we, it's a question, is it in our economic and political self-interest to do so. So today's hearing is an important hearing for the American people to see the energy abundance that our Lord blessed us with, and then the policymakers in this room and in this state, in this city, can decide what we want to do with it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you or any other person.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. At this time, I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman of California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that we're holding this hearing on North America's energy resources. We're going to hear testimony about fossil and renewable energy supplies in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We are dramatically improving the efficiency of our use of oil, so we're using less of it. At the same time, we're producing more domestic oil, which means we're importing less oil from dangerous parts of the world. We're unlocking new resources of natural gas, which is helping to limit the use of polluting coal and to increase the competitiveness of our domestic industries. We've doubled our capacity to generate renewable electricity from wind and solar in just 4 years, which has cut our pollution and invigorated clean energy manufacturing. These are all positive developments. The question we must ask is whether we are on a sustainable course for the years to come. In his inaugural address, President Obama said that we must transition to a sustainable energy future. He said we must respond to climate change because to do otherwise would, quote, betray our children and future generations, end quote. As we debate our energy future, this committee has a choice. It's an energy choice and a climate policy choice, and ultimately it's a moral choice. The biggest energy challenge we face as a country is carbon pollution. We can't have a conversation about America's energy policy without also having a conversation about climate change. We have a rapidly diminishing window of time to act to reduce our carbon pollution before the catastrophic impacts of climate change are irreversible. In November, the International Energy Agency published its World Energy Outlook. IEA concluded that our current global energy system is, quote, unsustainable, end quote. The International Energy Agency found that, quote, the climate goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius is becoming more difficult and more costly with each year that passes, end quote. The International Energy Agency also concluded that if the world does not take action to reduce carbon pollution before 2017, then all of the allowable CO2 emissions would be locked in by energy infrastructure existing at that time. That means that the energy policy decisions we make today will have a real and direct impact on whether we can limit climate change in the future. Every decision to build a new fossil fuel-fired power plant or construct a pipeline to transport tar sands or drill for more oil off our nation's coasts has climate risks. We need to understand and weigh those risks before we lock in infrastructure that will reduce carbon pollution for decades to come. There's an appeal to the energy resources we're discovering. We're stronger when we produce oil in the United States than when we import it from Saudi Arabia. We're better off when we produce our own natural gas than when we import LNG. But we also must recognize that the world has far more proven resources of oil, gas, and coal than we can ever safely use. The atmosphere has a rapidly shrinking capacity to safely absorb carbon. In fact, if we want to have a reasonable chance of limiting average global warming to 2 degrees centigrade or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, there's an estimated 5 times more carbon in proven fossil fuel reserves than we can release into the atmosphere. If we burn all the known reserves of fossil fuel without new technologies to sequester the carbon, the damage to the planet would be immense. The future will belong to the country that leads the inevitable transition to the clean energy economy of tomorrow. It's our responsibility to figure out how we make sure our nation is in the forefront of this change. Mr. Chairman, this is a new Congress. I want to begin it by offering to work with you as we grapple with these incredibly serious challenges. I look forward to this hearing and future hearings on this subject and to our cooperation to deal with these problems in a bipartisan and a balanced way. Thank you. Yield back the time.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. We appreciate your opening statement. And I also want to welcome Joe Pitts of Pennsylvania, who's a new member of this subcommittee. As many of you know, he's the chairman of the Health Subcommittee, and we're delighted to have him on the Energy and Power Subcommittee as well. We do have a new vice chairman also, Steve Scalise, who was here, but I think stepped out for just a moment. Right now, I'd like to get to our witnesses. We are thrilled with the panel that we have today. Each one of them are real experts in various fields and of energy, and we genuinely appreciate your testimony that you've prepared and that you're about to give. And I know that everyone will have questions for you. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. First, we have Adam Szymanski, who's been here a number of times. He's the administrator for the United States Energy Information Administration, and we welcome you. Dr. Daniel Yergin, who's vice chairman of IHS, and many of you know Mr. Yergin also because he wrote a book called The Prize, which won the Pulitzer Prize. So we're delighted that he's here. We have Jennifer Morgan, who is the director of the Climate and Energy Program at the World Resources Institute, and we look forward to your testimony, Ms. Morgan. We have Mary Hutzler, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the Institute for Energy Research. I read her testimony as well, and she has some great things to tell us today. And then we have Mr. Harry Vitas, who's vice president for ICF International, and we appreciate your thoughtful testimony as well, Mr. Vitas. So each one of you will be given 5 minutes for your opening statement, and there are a couple of little boxes with lights, and when it is green, it means go, and when it's red, it means stop. But we'll give you some leeway because we do respect your being here and appreciate your expertise. So, Mr. Szymanski, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss American energy security and innovation. EIA is a statistical and analytical agency within the U.S. Department of Energy. By law, its data, analyses, and forecasts are independent of approval by any officer or employee of the U.S. government. My statement today summarizes recent trends in production and draws on EIA's January short-term energy outlook. And also, I'm going to talk about resource estimates for oil, gas, coal, and renewables for the United States. As I discuss the different sectors, though, it's useful to keep in mind that the methodologies for developing reserve and resource estimates differ across the fuels. EIA estimates that U.S. total crude oil production averaged 6.4 million barrels a day in 2012, an increase of 8.8 million barrels a day, the largest actually since Colonel Drake drilled the first well, commercial crude oil well up in Titusville, Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts, back in 1859. Driven largely by growth in tight oil production. Now that's in Figure 1 of my written statement, which is in the record. Drilling in tight oil plays in North Dakota, Montana, and Texas are expected to account for the bulk of the forecast production growth over the next 2 years. U.S. crude oil production could reach 8 million barrels a day in 2014, and with some very strong assumptions about how drilling could proceed and other factors, could get as high as 10 million barrels a day, but that's not currently in our reference case. U.S. dry natural gas production has increased consistently since 2005, mainly because of production of shale gas resources. Total marketed production averaged about 69 billion cubic feet in 2012, and EIA expects production will remain close to that level this year and next year. Crude oil and natural gas proved reserve additions in 2010 were the highest recorded since EIA began publishing those numbers in 1977. Crude oil proved reserves increased by 12.8%, almost 3 billion barrels during 2010 to end the year at over 25 billion barrels. U.S. proved reserves of wet natural gas increased by almost 12%, 34 trillion cubic feet during 2010, ending that year at well over 300 trillion cubic feet. Next, I want to speak to the issue of oil and natural gas resources. Estimates of technically recoverable resources, while inherently uncertain, are a common measure of the long-term viability of U.S. domestic production. U.S. crude oil and least condensate resources in non-prohibited areas are estimated at 223 billion barrels in the annual energy outlook that we just published in December, up from EIA's estimate of 140 billion barrels back in the year 2000. That is despite cumulative production since the year 2000 of over 26 billion barrels of oil. U.S. total dry natural gas resources, 2,327 trillion cubic feet in the AEO 2013, are up from our 2000 estimate of nearly 1,600, maybe I should say only 1,600 trillion cubic feet, despite cumulative production between those years of 260 trillion cubic feet. The shale gas resource in the AEO 2013 is about 13% higher than what we estimated in 2012. Moving on to coal, domestic production decreased actually by 12% by over 1,000 million short tons between 2008 and 2012. Half of this decline between 2011 and 12 as electric utilities and the industrial sector cut back their purchases. EIA estimates that coal consumption and electric power in 2012 will total 829 million short tons, the lowest since 1992, due largely to competition from low natural gas prices. Coal exports in 2012 partially offset that decline in consumption. The largest category of coal resources demonstrated a reserve base, which represents coal in the ground. This resource base was originally estimated back in 1974 by the Bureau of Mines as part of the last comprehensive assessment that they made. In January 1 of 2012, the resource base was estimated to contain 483 billion short tons. That's a huge amount. Limited resources at EIA have prevented us from doing a full national assessment, but we have updated some of the regions. Finally, I'd like to highlight developments in renewable resources. EIA estimates that production of renewables, most renewables, grew significantly in 2012, especially wind and solar. Hydropower production fell because of the drought. Even so, the overall growth in renewable energy consumption from 2010 to 2012 was over 10%. Drought in the Midwest caused fuel ethanol production to fall by about 80,000 barrels a day. In the second half of 2012, we expect that production will pick back up again as the drought recedes, and we'll get back to pre-drought levels of about 870,000 barrels a day of ethanol production. Biodiesel production averaged 1 billion gallons in 2012 and is expected to rise to meet the RFS requirements of 1.28 billion gallons that have been set for 2013. That concludes my testimony. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Yergin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, I'm very pleased to be here.
Is your microphone on?
So I'll start over with 5 minutes. Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, it's really an honor to be here and to have the chance to share some thinking that fits into the framework of the discussion that the members have already laid out. It is indeed very timely because the United States is in the midst of an unconventional revolution in oil and gas that fits that all of the above strategy that Congressman Rush talked about, and also becomes increasingly apparent goes beyond energy itself. That is, it goes to the economy. And it's only become really apparent in the last year or two that this unconventional revolution is supporting currently about 1.7 million jobs in the United States. And it's not only in the oil and gas producing states. There are 44,000 jobs in New York, which doesn't produce 39,000 jobs in the state of Illinois. We think that overall job number will rise to 3 million by 2020. Last year, this unconventional revolution brought $62 billion in revenues to the federal and state government. By 2020, that number could be close to $115 billion. It is helping to stimulate a manufacturing renaissance in the United States. We've noted something like $95 billion of plans for investment in the chemical sector in the United States. Don't know if all of that will get done, but that demonstrates it. It's certainly improving the competitive position of the United States in the world and beginning to affect global geopolitics. I think although great advance has been made in solar and wind, I talk about them in the quest as the rebirth of renewables. Those are really innovations from the last century. In terms of this century, what's happening in oil and gas is the biggest energy innovation so far of the 21st century. It has unfolded fast. Those of you who participated in hearings in 2008 remember those dark, dire days when, I think as Chairman Whitfield reminded, the world was going to run out of oil and the United States was going to run out of oil even more quickly. How that has changed. Shale gas now has gone from 2% of our supply to 37% of our supply. And what is really dramatic is what's happened on oil, which instead of continuing its long decline has increased dramatically by almost 39% since 2008. That increase is equivalent, because you say, well, what does that mean? It's equivalent to the entire output of Nigeria, the 7th largest oil exporting country in OPEC. It is equivalent, almost equivalent, to Iran's total exports before sanctions went into place. Indeed, it is sobering to consider that without these technologies and the oil output that's resulted from them, the sanctions on Iran might well have failed. The environmental aspects have been touched on. U.S. carbon dioxide emissions from energy consumption are down 13% since 2007. I think in the discussion we might get to some of the conclusions that we came to as the Deutsch Committee, the subcommittee of the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, set up at the behest of President Obama on managing the environmental issues around this. One thing we did come out of that hearing is a focus on the role of the states, and in particular the activities of Stronger, the collaborative organization of the states that seeks to collaborative benchmarking and standard setting. Let me come finally to something that is always contentious, which is imports and exports of oil and energy, which has been a major issue for the United States for about 70 years. Until the end of the last decade, it seemed that the question was only how fast would oil imports go up and how big would our imports of natural gas become, as the chairman referred to in his remarks. Well, this unconventional revolution has sure turned that around. Mr. Rush has cited the decline in our imports over the last 7 years or so forth, and this is a result both of surging production and greater efficiency. Moreover, the flow of imports has changed. Canada now supplies about 27% of our total. But what gets the most attention right now is the question of whether we're going to become an exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas. And I think this needs to be looked at in terms of the overall U.S. supply and global competition. Our view, similar to others, is that the market in the U.S. is demand constrained, not supply constrained. Many LNG projects have been announced. We think only a handful will be built, these $10 billion projects. The reason is both cost and scale of global competition. Currently, already, before any of these get going, already about equivalent to a third of total existing capacity, new projects are under construction or been committed. So the U.S. capacity will be coming into a market in which there will be new supplies from Australia, new sources such as offshore East Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, Canada. Just yesterday, Canada approved a major export project to Asia. Finally, there's shale gas development that will occur elsewhere. So these will all be offsets. So let me just add one other thing. I think for decades the United States has made the free flow of energy supplies really one of the cornerstone principles of our foreign policy. It is a principle we've urged on many other nations. So to me, at least, it's puzzling how we can say to a close ally like Japan, suffering energy shortages as a result of Fukushima, that on the one hand, we want you to import less oil from Iran, yet on the other hand, we don't want to consider new natural gas exports to Japan. So those are some thoughts for consideration on it. I'll just conclude by saying certainly expanded domestic supply will add resilience to shocks and add to our security cushion. Moreover, prudent expansion of U.S. energy exports will actually add an additional dimension to U.S. influence in the world. However, there remains only one world oil market, and a disruption anywhere will be a disruption anywhere. So anyway, altogether, this unconventional oil and gas revolution has already had a major impact in multiple dimensions. Its significance will continue to grow as it continues to unfold, and these opportunities certainly provide a timely opportunity for assessing the impact and significance in its many dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yergin. Ms. Morgan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I work for the World Resources Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we focus on the intersection of environment and improving people's lives. I'm very delighted to speak here today about America's abundant energy resources and the smart choices we need to make to deliver them. And I have 2 main points to share with you today. First is that an effective, durable, and affordable energy strategy must consider the risks of climate change. Why? Well, our climate is changing. Each successive decade in the last 50 years has been the warmest on record globally, and extreme weather events are on the rise, with tens of billions of dollars in damages in the U.S. each year. A 2010 National Research Council report concluded that, quote, climate change is occurring, is caused largely by human activities, and poses significant risk for, and in many cases is already affecting, a broad range of human and natural systems. This is the message of numerous comprehensive science assessments, including the draft National Climate Assessment that was released last month. Directly relevant to this subcommittee, our electric infrastructure and reliability are already being affected and are increasingly vulnerable to droughts and other disruptions caused by climate change. Current impacts on energy production are just the beginning. Unless we change course, these impacts will become more extreme, placing our energy infrastructure and our country at great risk. Which brings me to my second point, which I think is very important. To avoid the most serious climate change impacts, our energy policy must drive low-carbon technologies forward now and build them out at a much larger scale. The good news is that we don't have to choose between energy security and climate security. America is rich in renewable resources and has large opportunities to increase efficiency. According to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, 80% of our electricity needs can be met in 2050 through renewable generation and existing technology. We can also improve our efficiency across the economy. The National Academy of Sciences found that the U.S. could save 30% of the energy used. And reducing methane emissions from natural gas and capturing and storing CO2 can put us on the cutting edge of technology development, which I think is a true win-win. If the U.S., however, and if we decide not to move forward with a low-carbon future now, we risk not only the severe impacts of climate change, but also stranded investments from short-term, poorly informed planning. Many utilities are already factoring in climate change into their investment decisions, and they're looking for regulatory and climate policy certainty. Investments in high-polluting resources, I think will prove to be a poor bet over time, and these investments will be at direct physical risk from increasing impacts. So without a rapid shift to a low-carbon economy, the U.S. is also going to miss out on the clean technology market around the world. The global market for low-carbon technology could double or triple by 2020. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I think the United States has the opportunity to be both energy and climate secure in the future, and Congress can help and assist in that effort through policies that, first, ensure climate change risks are more directly incorporated into both public and private decision-making. Two, build out America's clean energy sector through an approach that is comprehensive, long-term, targeted, and inclusive. Three, increase energy efficiency across the economy. And four, provide funding and incentives for low-carbon and clean energy technologies. Ultimately, Congress should work together to build national energy policies that take these climate risks very seriously and take advantage of all of the opportunities presented by our abundant clean energy resources. Thank you very much for the opportunity, sir.
Well, thank you, Ms. Morgan, and Ms. Hutzler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to participate in today's hearing. The Institute for Energy Research is a nonprofit think tank that conducts research and analysis concerning global energy issues. In the last several years, IER has monitored closely the boom in energy production that is taking place in the United States, primarily on private and state lands. IER also tracks regulations and policies that limit the potential to reduce our dependence on overseas oil regimes, hinder our ability to generate much-needed revenues, and harm efforts to foster an energy-based economic recovery that creates jobs. Just this morning, we released a study on the economic effect of immediately opening federal lands onshore and offshore to energy production. According to our analysis, immediately opening federal lands that are currently unavailable because of statutory or administrative action would result in an additional $14.4 trillion to our GDP over the next 37 years. In light of the recent Commerce Department report that GDP shrank for the first time since 2009, our economy needs the lasting stimulus that robust energy development on federal lands and waters would provide. But today's hearing is focused primarily on the resource availability and the potential under our feet and off our shores to achieve domestic energy goals, almost unthinkable just a few years ago. In fact, for decades, Americans were asking the question, where will we get the energy we need to heat our homes, fuel our cars, and meet the demands of a strong 21st century economy? Due to hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling technologies, we no longer question whether we have the resources. Rather, we question whether we will be able to develop them, and thus reap the nationwide economic benefits such development would foster. The myth of energy scarcity that has plagued our national conversation has been exposed. Just in the last year, the misleading refrain that the U.S. only possesses 2% of the world's oil reserves has been replaced by the mounting evidence of our nation's resource abundance. IER highlighted this in an inventory of North America's energy resources. Using government information, we cataloged the vast resources of the United States and our neighbors. The U.S. has enough resources to provide reliable and affordable energy for centuries to come. The question is whether the federal government will permit us to access these abundant resources and not whether sufficient resources exist. We can now unlock our shale resources using technology proven for more than 60 years in over 1 million wells without a single confirmed case of contamination. Furthermore, while our use of fossil energy has dramatically increased over the last 50 years, our air quality has improved. According to the EPA, emissions from the 6 criteria pollutants under the Clean Air Act have decreased 68% since 1970, even though our energy consumption has increased by 45%. Therefore, however, troubling trends in policy that threaten to restrict access to our vast energy resources, which could make American-made energy less available, affordable, and reliable. Oil shale development has all but stopped because administration policy withdrew research and much-needed leasing activity that could bring these resources to market. Increased oil sands imports from our neighbor Canada could free the U.S. from energy dependence on foreign countries, where American workers face increasing threats of kidnapping by terrorists and even murder. But we need the transportation infrastructure to get it here, and the energy security that this infrastructure would provide. Onshore development on federal lands, which is roughly estimated at 700 million acres of subsurface mineral estate, is extremely limited and is increasingly so. In fiscal 2009, for example, the current administration leased fewer onshore acres for energy development than in any preceding year on record. Offshore development on 1.76 billion acres of mineral lands has suffered from a de facto administration embargo, with lease plans canceled, moratoria imposed, and cumbersome regulatory activity that serve to discourage exploration. Today, permitting delays by federal regulators have driven the wait to more than 300 days before drilling can begin on federal lands, about twice as long as it took in 2005. By contrast, states like North Dakota are now turning permits in 10 days, in Ohio 14 days, in Colorado 27 days. Alaska's energy resources lie dormant, even though its pipeline has enough unused capacity to take twice the daily production of North Dakota. Decisions made today about access to energy resources affect energy production for years and decades to come. The more areas accessible to energy production today increases the likelihood of domestic production tomorrow, and with it increased jobs, government revenues, and economic activity. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hutzler, and Mr. Vitas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss my work in estimating the U.S. endowment of oil and natural gas resources. Due to technology advancements, the U.S. natural gas and oil resource base is now widely seen as large and diverse. Lower 48 production of shale gas, tight oil, and associated natural gas liquids has been an engine of economic growth in recent years. Our analysis of the remaining resource base indicates that this unconventional resource base is large and that this production activity is in the early stages of the resource development cycle. Therefore, we expect growing production and increased jobs many years into the future. In recent years, ICF has extensively evaluated shale gas and tight oil resources, both in terms of technical and economic recovery. This work has been sponsored by private companies, industry associations, and government agencies. We have evaluated the geologic, historic production, and cost of all the major U.S. and Canadian geologic settings, or as we say, plays. This analysis shows that these resources are geographically widespread and are economic to develop at moderate wellhead prices. The ICF analysis of these emerging natural gas and oil resources is done using a geographical information system, a process that evaluates the resources in a highly granular level, accounting for variations in geology, resource quality, and economics within the plays. This ICF analysis reflects recent upstream technology advances, including advances in horizontal drilling and steering, multi-stage hydraulic fracturing, improvements in fracturing fluids and methods, and improvements in seismic and geophysical analysis that helps identify the best locations for the wells. And finally, I would point out advances that reduce the environmental impacts of drilling. These are such things as using multi-well drilling pads, conservation of water and recycling of water resources, reformulation of chemical additives, and reduced emission completions that capture gases in the flowback. These upstream technology advances have enlarged the U.S. economic resource base by expanding areas where the drilling can take place, increasing recovery factors, and reducing capital and operating costs per unit of production. ICF estimates that the remaining technical recoverable U.S. natural gas resource base is 3,850 trillion cubic feet, which represents 155 years of current consumption. The U.S. shale gas resource is almost 2,000 TCF, and that makes up 52% of the total. One should look at these assessments as conservative in the sense that they are developed assuming current technology, and no major new plays are discovered. In terms of U.S. oil production, as already been mentioned, U.S. production started increasing in the year 2009 for the first time since 1984. And there is the potential for the U.S. to become a much larger producer in the coming decades due, as we've heard, from expanded production of tight oil. Our current assessment of U.S. oil resources in terms of technically recoverable resources is 264 billion barrels. This represents 110 years of production at current production rates. The U.S. tight oil potential is excellent due to the wide range of potential producing plays and diverse geologic settings in numerous basins. The success in tight oil across a wide spectrum of geologic setting indicates that most historic oil-producing areas will eventually see horizontal drilling. And in many cases, this tight oil development will dominate activity and production. So in summary, recent advances in drilling and completion technologies have dramatically increased estimates of technically recoverable natural gas and oil resources and have led to a much more optimistic outlook for future oil, gas, and natural gas liquids production. Our forecast for natural gas is that it's going to be growing at about 2.2% per year up to about 32 TCF by 2025. And our forecast for the oil production is even faster, 2.6% up to 9 million barrels per day by 25. The other point I want to make is that we expect upstream technologies to continue to improve, and therefore we expect these resource-based numbers to be going up in the future as well as the economic to improve as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vitas. At this time, we'll go into the question and answer period, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Once again, I will thank all of you for your testimony. Quite encouraging that we find ourselves in America today with an abundant natural resources, gas, oil, coal, as well as renewables. And your testimony, as I had indicated in my opening statement, how just a short period of time ago, how everyone was talking about we were depleting our natural resources. So it's really exciting that we find ourselves in America in this situation, and particularly at a time when we really are in a global marketplace and we find ourselves competing with other countries for jobs and for job creation. And how many of you attended the World Economic Forum in Davos? Dr. Jurgen, okay. Now, I had read some comments that there was a lot of discussion in Davos about the focus on American energy independence. And the articles that I read indicated it was a major concern for the Europeans because, fortunately, in America, most of our production and discoveries have occurred on private lands, which we've been able to develop even though permits on public lands is down. And I know that in Europe, a lot of these discoveries are on government-owned lands. But would you make a comment about your observation of the Europeans' views on what's happening in America in the energy sector?
Yes. I think it was summarized for me at the World Economic Forum. I asked a prominent journalist what he thought the #1 theme was, and I expected him to say the euro, and he said shale. And it took me by surprise, but I think that, it takes time for thinking to catch up with changes. And I think Europe is suffering from enormous unemployment problems. Spain is 26% unemployment. And they're looking at the United States and saying, United States, because of this low-cost, abundant energy, is going to be a very formidable competitor. And people kind of stopping investing in Europe and wanting to transfer their investment to the United States. And I think companies that are European-based saying that they're going to be at a disadvantage competing against the United States. I heard the same thing when I was in China for the publication of my book, The Quest. Spent 2 weeks there, and I heard the same intense discussion about shale and the sense that the U.S. was going to changing the competitive playing field in the global economy because of this. So I think the rest of the world has really kind of become obsessed with this development in the United States because of how it changes the competition, as I say, in the global marketplace.
Well, I agree, and I think we're very fortunate to live here, and the policies that we adopt are going to go a long way in determining how far we can go down this road. And as I said in the beginning, one of our primary focuses today is about economic growth and job creation, and we have what I'll refer to as the magic key to really facilitate that in many ways. Let me just briefly talk about the export of liquefied natural gas. I know it's controversial, And I know there are a lot of different sides to it. My understanding is the permit has been issued and there's a facility being built in Louisiana for the purpose of doing that. I know the chemical industry, for example, very much opposed to it. But would some of you just make a brief comment on what you think about it? I mean, do you think this is something we should be looking at? When you think about the impact it would have on our trade deficit, too, that's good. But Dr. Yergin, I know you mentioned it briefly. Just give me your views on it.
Well, I think that some of us can remember a few years ago when we were going to have all these importing facilities for LNG, and you'd look at a map and you see 30 or 40 of them, and it turned out it's sort of zero right now. So I think there's a kind of boom discussion about all these facilities, and our conclusion is that the number that will be built is perhaps, you could count them on one hand, because a lot of the discussion has left out, as I said, the competitive factor that there are a lot of other people. Canada might have 3 to 5 just in British Columbia, and they cost a lot, and a lot of new projects. There's new gas off East Africa. There's new gas off Israel. All of that's going to be coming into the marketplace. So that will kind of put a balance out upon it. And I think, as many of us feel in this panel, that the issue is that we're demand constrained. We have a lot of gas, and so it would not have a dramatic impact on gas costs, and it would unfold over a decade or more.
Did you want to make a comment, Ms. Morgan? Or
We haven't worked extensively on LNG exports, but I think the key point, I think, across the board is if the U.S. is successful in integrating carbon capture and storage along with gas from shale and other resources, you actually, I think, would have even greater opportunities.
See, my time has expired, so at this time I recognize the gentleman from Illinois for 5 minutes, Mr. Rush.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Yergin, and your testimony, and it's so good to see you again. I remember having breakfast with you with the Aspen Institute, and I thought you did quite well then, and you're doing quite well now. But in your testimony, you report that the unconventional energy revolution supports 1.7 million jobs currently, and that number will grow significantly over the next decade. Can you speak to these new jobs, what we can expect to see, how will the number grow, the types of jobs that will be created, and where these jobs will be located nationally?
We undertook this research over about the last 6 or 7 months, and we were surprised by a couple of things. One, the scale of the jobs. We use the same methodology that the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Commerce Department uses. And secondly, that it really spread across all the states. That's why I mentioned New York and Illinois as examples, because of these long supply chains. And I think this, too, if we talk about the surprises around unconventional resources, the first surprise was the scale of it and the speed, and the second has been this wider economic impact. So the jobs, that 1.7 million that we talk about, includes direct jobs, which would actually be working in the oil and gas fields. It would include the technology jobs, the service jobs that support it. And then it's the jobs that are created, this is called the induced jobs, that are created by the rising incomes that people have to spend, and it's the kind of services that would be provided. So it's a kind of package of all of them, and it's a demonstration of how tightly integrated our national economy is, that it goes across the entire country. So it could be everything from somebody working in manufacturing steel in Ohio to somebody working in information technology in California that feeds into this industry.
Are we equipped now, is the American workforce prepared to take these jobs? Are we prepared to deal with these jobs?
Well, I think so up to a point, but it does require training. And for instance, the state of Ohio is getting prepared for activity there, and Governor Kasich there has made a big emphasis on vocational training in the schools to train workers who would be working directly in the oil or gas fields in the Utica Shale, as it's called. I think it is striking that this job creation or job support has really occurred during a period of high unemployment, and it's been, in a sense, one of the bright spots during this 5 tough economic years that we've had.
Thank you. Ms. Morgan, in your testimony, you state that the U.S. has been a world leader in clean energy research and development, but has had less success relative to other countries in actually developing a domestic clean energy manufacturing industry. In your opinion, what has prevented the U.S. from developing a robust clean energy manufacturing sector?
Thank you. We recently did an assessment across 5 countries of the wind and solar value chain to look at who's winning the clean energy race. And what we found across the board is that the countries that are ahead, which include Germany and China, have a long-term policy signal that provides certainty for investors in manufacturing. So you need to have something that goes beyond 3 years. So now with our short-term benefits, you may see some wind turbines come up, but you may be creating the perverse piece where you're not creating the manufacturing capacity domestically because there's no long-term policy signal around renewable energy. And therefore, you may see the import of those parts because investors don't know what's going to happen in 2 years or 3 years. So it's mostly that lack of national renewable energy policy that's lacking here.
Along the same lines, what does the U.S. need to do to become a net exporter of clean energy technology?
I think there are a number of pieces across the value chain that would be essential. The first is that national policy that provides that long-term certainty. So that can be anything from a renewable portfolio standard to a feed-in tariff to whatever policy of choice provides that long-term certainty. The second really is putting in place the innovation centers that bring together public and private actors to be able to develop those new technologies rapidly. The third is to increase our research and development. We're doing pretty well there, but our problem really is that although we're leading the world in R&D, we're not doing it fast enough vis-a-vis other players. Thank you.
Chairman, you've been very kind.
Thank you. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Mr. Yergin if he is familiar with the emerging technology on hydraulic fracturing that greatly minimizes the amount of water that's used. Have you studied that to any detail?
I'm certainly aware of companies who are working to perhaps reduce the water requirements by as much as 75%. And I think, you know, one of the things when we did this study for the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, we said that the needs here, as your question suggests, are going to really promote a lot of innovation. And it sure is a lot of innovation is going into the water issues right now, and reducing the water usage is a major target.
There's a company in my district, and then there's a number of companies around the country that they haven't commercialized it to a great degree yet, but they have certainly shown that it works on a prototype basis, and some of them can take as much as 99% of the water that's currently used to frack a well. It's no longer necessary, and I think if we can solve that issue satisfactorily, the sky's the limit. I think that seems to be the larger environmental issue.
And Congressman Barton, if I can say, it is striking that this is all, you know, this is only in the last 4 or 5 years, and already to see this kind of to see this innovative response, which is part of our hearing, it kind of shows the creativity of our industries to respond to immediate needs.
When I was chairman of the full committee, we passed a bill called the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and we put in language that gave the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission ultimate say on siting LNG facilities for import. We thought we were going to be importing liquefied natural gas. That authority is now being used by the FERC to license facilities to export, in some cases the same facility. They're just turning it around. do you see LNG for export radically changing the price structure for natural gas, which right now is a little under $3 a thousand cubic feet?
No, we don't see LNG exports as having a major impact on price. I mean, what we see is a continuing growth of supply, and there's actually a need for additional market, whether it's LNG, whether it's vehicles, whether it's electric power, and we don't think that these projects will have much impact.
So you don't see any national security issues if we were to license LNG facilities?
I think we see a gain to national security from the United States being an energy exporter, and the influence that will come from that's a net positive for our national security.
I happen to agree with that. And finally, I've got about another minute and a half. Dr. Yergin, how do you see the combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling in terms of oil production? A lot of companies down in Texas 5 or 6 years ago, when I talked to them about using this technology for oil production, they kind of laughed. They said, it's just not the same. It doesn't work. And a company in Houston, EOG, and also a privately owned company, Hunt Energy up in Dallas, they decided to try it. And I'll be darned. All you have to do is look at the Bakken up in North Dakota, and I think almost all of that production is horizontally drilled with hydraulic fracturing. Do you see that becoming the norm, or do you still see the conventional drilling for oil dominating?
I think it's really spreading. I mean, it is, as you say, it was only around, this only really is 2009, 2010 that it took off for oil, and I think the numbers keep, I don't know what Administrator Szyminski would say, but the numbers keep exceeding the projections. It's happening so fast, and we see it being applied in traditional areas like the Permian Basin, which has been pronounced dead several times, and of course is going through another.
Had an all-time year last year.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be applied, and I think that we'll see probably the impact of this faster globally than we'll see it in terms of natural gas.
My final question is to Mr. Szyminski. Do you see the United States being self-sufficient in oil production in the next 10 years?
In oil production?
Yes, sir.
In our reference case for the annual energy outlook, which we just published, we have oil self-sufficiency getting down to the low 30s, low 30%. So 30% of our consumption would still be imported. In the side cases, which we will run and publish in March, so the complete set of side cases for the annual energy outlook, we've looked at what it would take to get to self-sufficiency in oil, and it involves closer well spacing, greater estimates of what the resource base is, and a number of other factors that would drive oil production higher. We also looked at the demand side. That is, could fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, for example, be improved, and other steps it could take to reduce demand. In that set of circumstances, which requires further policy changes on both supply and demand, we could get to a crossover where the U.S. would be self-sufficient.
You're not saying it's probable, but it is possible.
It is possible.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to follow my colleague from Texas and the success we've had on directional drilling in both natural gas and oil. You might remember you were chair of the committee, Congressman Barton, in 2005 when we did a bipartisan energy bill that we put in a little provision for the DOE to do a study on directional drilling because they had a great lab in Wyoming to do it. And we had a Houston or a Texas company who was drilling at that time out to 35,000 feet, and they thought they could get to 50,000 and on. And we're seeing some of the success of that both for natural gas but also for the tight oil, as we call it. I've always believed our balanced energy policy must support all domestic sources of energy, including oil, natural gas, and renewables. And again, the last question was, we're also using our energy smarter now, because each time I buy a new car, I'm getting 5 to 10 miles more per gallon than I did on the previous one. So we're using our energy smarter. Limiting this production will only serve to jeopardize our small business jobs and increase our reliance on foreign sources of energy. It may also have an impact on our ability to address climate change, because if we fail to provide the natural gas needed to meet our short-term carbon reduction targets while providing affordable, reliable sources to American consumers. Administrator Szymanski, the EIA expects the used natural gas production to remain close to its 2012 level in both 2013 and 14. Is that correct? I know currently there are a lot of wells comprised of just gas, or just dry gas, that are not being produced due to the low price of natural gas. This is one of the reasons I support the export of LNG, so that there is an additional incentive to produce these gas wells. Has EIA looked at what these export opportunities might mean for our future natural gas production levels?
We have done that. If coming back to the point about what's the major driver behind why we have natural gas holding even this year and next year, it's mainly because we're assuming natural gas prices are going to recover up towards $4 by the end of next year. That begins to allow coal to compete more effectively for electric utility generation markets, and holds natural gas back. So one of the interesting factors here that comes into play is that if, because of continuing strong supplies, natural gas prices remain low, that would actually lead to more demand in the electric utility sector. As far as LNG is concerned, and in response to the question that Chairman Whitfield asked at the beginning of the hearing, Mr. Green, the U.S. is already exporting natural gas. We export by pipeline to Mexico and Canada. Of course, we get more gas from Canada. In the reference case that we examined for the annual energy outlook, EIA has LNG exports from the lower 48 states and Alaska rising towards about 5% of domestic output over the period out to 2040.
Well, I actually have two issues, I guess, on that. One, I represent an area that's heavy in chemical industry who's concerned about the rise in natural gas prices, but I also know that when I drive through South Texas and I see so much flaring of the dry gas, because we don't either have the capacity or the infrastructure or the customers for it, it's just such a waste of our utilization of natural gas. And so if we could sell it to someone for $15 an MCF, I wouldn't mind doing that. So, but the EIA incorporated the increased use of enhanced oil recovery in its oil projections. In Texas, for example, the use of EOR has changed our predicted production levels, and you mentioned the Permian Basin area as a good example of that.
We have built in some assumptions along those lines, and in separate cases, we look at other factors that could help drive oil production. One of the main questions raised at this hearing is what's the extent of the resource base, and if we were to see the same improvements that have taken place in the last 5 years in natural gas occurring in the oil shale area, what we would end up saying is that rather than our roughly 6.4 million barrels a day of oil production we had last year, getting up to about 8 before it begins to taper off, that it could get up closer to 10 million barrels a day and then hold pretty steady at that level. And one of those things includes better technology and recovery.
Well, in 10 million barrels a day sounds like a lot, but I actually have 5 refineries in East Houston and Harris County that use over 1 million barrels a day right now to make refined products. So we still are going to have to import or produce the needs for our own country.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
At this time, recognize Vice Chair Mr. Scalise for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you having this hearing on America's energy security and specifically to look at an assessment of our resources because, you know, I think the Chairman had mentioned the first natural gas facility, the first LNG export facility is in South Louisiana. I've actually toured that facility, Cheniere's facility in South Louisiana, and that was originally built to be an import facility because we didn't think we had the reserves that we needed for natural gas. And then eventually, because of the technology, the advancements that brought all these shale plays online, now the actual opposite has happened, where we have so much that in many cases they're not even drilling in areas where they have leases because all of a sudden we found these resources that we didn't really know we could access just a few years ago. And so they spent billions of dollars to retrofit and shift that from an import facility to an export facility, allowing us to create more American jobs and to continue to advance that new technology, which has really helped start a revolution, as I think a number of you talked about in your testimony. And I want to ask you, Ms. Hutzler, because you specifically mentioned production on federal lands versus non-federal lands, and it's one of the misnomers that we hear about up here in Washington. You know, and the president will go around saying production's never been higher, and yet you actually look in some of his policies that have shut production off on federal lands in the areas where the federal government doesn't currently have the ability to go and have an impact in those states where they're seeing a real revolution. It's on non-federal lands. So if you can touch a little bit on that, about maybe some of the factors behind such an increase on non-federal lands where you actually have some problems, in some cases reductions on federal lands on production.
Production, for instance, production of oil on private and state lands over the past 5 years has increased, is essentially 96% of the total production that we've gotten. And the reason generally is that there's a lot of red tape when you try to deal with production on federal lands. And I think I mentioned in my opening remarks and in my testimony that it takes over 300 days to now get a permit to drill on federal lands, where in the states it's less than 30 days. So all of this is taking much longer for a company to invest their money in terms of trying to deal with production on federal lands.
Yeah, and we can see, especially if you look at the shale natural gas plays, they're actually regulated. You know, the EPA might try to give the impression that there's no federal regulations and they need to step in, and I think that concerns a lot of people because the EPA doesn't have a good track record of implementing good regulations, where states have actually done a really good job at regulating natural gas shale plays, and frankly the topography in Louisiana is a whole lot different than it is in Pennsylvania or North Dakota or Texas. And so the states have the ability to do that much better and have a great track record, by the way, of doing that. And so I think it's a good point to make because where we've seen real growth, and not only in energy but in jobs, where you know, you go to North Dakota, and lowest unemployment in the nation. They have up there because of all of this new economic growth coming from this technology. And so we surely don't want to see the federal government come in and try to slow that down in the name of good regulations, when in fact you already have good regulations, but the way it's supposed to be done, and that is where the states themselves do it. I want to ask you, Mr. Vitas, because you've looked at some of the data. We get data from the Energy Information Agency, and they've even shown that there's been a decrease in production on federal lands. But some of the information you have on resources, on the known resources, are dramatically higher. I think 50% in some cases higher than the numbers that come out of EIA. Can you explain what data you look at that shows that the outlook for this country is even better than what we get from the EIA's numbers?
Well, in any type of resource assessment, there's going to be uncertainty because what we're talking about is some activity that is yet to happen. So we're predicting then the productivity of potentially hundreds of thousands of wells that will be drilled in the future. And the way we do it is to first start with the geology and to develop maps of each of the plays. And we try to deal with and get data on the key parameters, like what's called the structure maps, which is the drilling depth you need to go down to, the thickness of the shale, some of the parameters of the shale in terms of their carbon content, their porosity, the pressures and temperatures. And from that we can develop what's called a gas in place estimate, which is an estimate of how much gas there is in the ground in the formations that would be targeted. And then we have information on wells that have already been drilled and we can look at their production profiles and estimate over their lives how much gas they're going to produce. So, for example, if we looked at Pennsylvania and we looked at the Marcellus Shale, we would see that the horizontal wells there that have been drilled have been improving in terms of their productivity, and now we're producing about 4.5 billion cubic feet per well. But that's in the better parts of the play because producers have gone to look for the best gas first, the most economic gas. But then we can look at the other areas of the play in terms of either being thinner or less pressure or lower porosity, and we can correct for the productivity using basic engineering principles and thereby forecast out into the future productivity of the wells, which we think on average will be about half of that, maybe 2 BCF per well.
All right. Well,
So
I
we
appreciate your, I know I'm seeing I'm out of time. I
sorry.
apologize. But I thank you for your testimony and your answers. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. And thank you, each of you, for your testimony. You know, assessing our current energy resources is obviously important, especially in the light of the numerous advancements in research and technology in recent years. And that's why I appreciate today's hearing, but I am concerned that we're not getting the full picture. Today's testimony and the questions coming from the majority have focused overwhelmingly on fossil fuels. Oil, natural gas, and coal obviously dominate our energy supply, but they're certainly not the only resources available. The EIA Energy Outlook makes this clear, pointing out that renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and biofuels make up a sizable portion of our energy use. So my first question is to you, Administrator Szymanski. EIA projects that use of renewables will continue to grow, in some cases by double digits. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. We actually have renewables growing the fastest in percentage terms of all of the fuel sources over the period out to 2040. I'd also like to point out that the share of generation of electricity from renewables grew about 13% in 2001. It should grow at about 16% annually out to 2040. Electricity generation from solar and to a lesser extent wind energy sources grows as recent cost declines make them more economical. The 2013 projection is a little bit less optimistic about advanced biofuels because of the difficulty that the companies have had in gearing up their manufacturing process. But in general, renewables are growing pretty strongly and help the fact that overall carbon dioxide emissions from energy in our forecast actually remain below the peak that we reached of 6 billion metric tons that was hit in 2005. So it stays below that level the entire forecast period.
Thank you. And in addition to what you just said, Ms. Morgan, you established the direct link between burning fossil fuels and climate change, and that has already been well established from a variety of sources. And we've begun to see these impacts if we just even look at extreme weather events like Hurricane Sandy, droughts, all the droughts and the wildfires as well. And I represent a coastal state and a coastal district. I'm particularly mindful of climate change impacts on higher sea levels and increasing erosion. Yes. Ms. Morgan, in your testimony, you discussed some of these impacts. Could you elaborate particularly on sea level rise and increased erosion for those of us who do represent coastal communities?
Certainly, yes. Sea level rise is one of the major threats to the United States and is already occurring along the eastern seaboard and certainly also on the west coast. I'm familiar, we've done some work looking in Florida, particularly where you see that Miami Beach is already having to spend more than $200 million to overhaul its storm damage system. You're seeing that Hallandale Beach has to spend $10 million a year on new wells because of saltwater intrusion. Florida's built on limestone, which means sea walls don't help much. So that is a major piece of worry. Also, certainly the energy infrastructure that's located along the coast is also at risk.
I just want to add an example to that. I represent the central coast of California, and the city of Pismo Beach is installing seawalls itself to protect 2 sewage lift stations that are threatened by erosion. And in Santa Barbara, our central creek that comes right down through the heart of the city has been widened to increase its flood capacity. These projects come at a high cost, And I know these communities have struggled to find necessary resources. One final, in the last few seconds, is this something other communities are also struggling with and finding that the cost is really prohibitive?
Absolutely. I know in Florida, there's 4 counties that have joined together and are facing tremendous costs. If you look here in Lewis, Delaware, not far away from here, you have communities that are struggling with it. Go up to Maine. So it's a real issue that we need to face on our infrastructure investments, but also the cost to local communities. It puts an imperative on emission reductions as well.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
This time, recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this fall, I hosted a natural gas forum in Omaha, where we had representatives from just about every facet of the natural gas world, from users, producers, and potential future users. One theme came from that, and that's that we have a great supply of natural gas. We can argue 100 years or 150 years. That there is enough supply that we could expand the uses of natural gas into transportation. And this begs the question of, well, we've been talking about exporting surplus, but we could also have discussions of additional uses of natural gas. But one thing always came back, and that's the uncertainty of regulations. And the regulations, when you drilled further down, were defined as uncertainty about whether the government, federal government, was going to start regulating fracking, and how, if and how. And that in itself is the worry for the users. I am one of those that feels that expanding natural gas into vehicles will help our country, not only because we're using a domestic product, but the fact that a diversity in auto fuels, whether we start with trucks, heavy trucks, or whatever, enhances our national security status. So, starting with Szymanski, Mr. Szymanski, Honorable, and then going down, this is the question I would like to have your respective opinions, and is it fair to say that moving more of our transportation to natural gas will impact our national security?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, for calling me honorable. I guess I get that because the Senate confirmed me in my appointment. I tell people that a lot of folks in my new place of employment call me sir, and that's very different than when I was in the private sector, but I have to fly economy when I travel.
I understand that. With the 9% approval rating here, and we get called a lot of things, but honorable is not one of them.
I think that you're onto a really interesting question here. We've actually took a look at how quickly natural gas could grow in transportation, and it's a very small number now. I mean, rounding error in terms of percentages. We do use 3% of our natural gas to move natural gas in the pipelines, but when most people think about transportation, they're thinking about trucks or cars and so on. We believe that LNG and freight trucks, and then eventually natural gas being turned into liquids like a high-quality diesel fuel. And there's a plan under consideration down in Louisiana to do just that. Could actually almost double the amount of total natural gas in transportation, so that we could get up from 3% now to maybe easily 6% and possibly as high as 8 or 9%. A lot of that is because natural gas prices from a pricing standpoint look really, really attractive compared to global oil prices. So there's a lot of effort underway there.
I think we have pretty much the same view as EIA, that you know, it does now appear that natural gas will become an important fuel for large trucks, for railroads and so forth. At this point, don't see it becoming a major fuel for private automobiles because of the nature of the infrastructure and so forth that would be needed.
No, I'd like to hear your opinion.
Happy to.
You're the contrarian here.
We haven't done extensive research on this area, but the one piece that I can add to the discussion perhaps is that it's clear that gas has a lower global warming potential than oil.
Yes.
So from that perspective, it's more beneficial. And I think, as I was saying earlier, if we can also tackle the carbon capture and storage piece of that, you'll see even greater benefit.
All right, thank you.
From our standpoint, we essentially agree with Dr. Jurgen in the sense that there's certainly a market in the heavy truck area, and it's easier to deal with the infrastructure problems there of supplying the natural gas. But in the private sector, for residential vehicles, home vehicles, it's more difficult.
The analysis that we've done is very similar, that although we expect natural gas and liquefied natural gas vehicles to triple their use over the next 20 or 25 years, it still represents a relatively small part of the overall sector. The more likely way that natural gas could be used to displace oil would be through gas to liquids technologies, or even using natural gas to generate electricity and then using electricity in battery cars.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
This time recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also thank the witnesses for being with us today. I'm pleased to be back on the Energy and Power Subcommittee of this Congress, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to comprehensively address our nation's energy needs, and that also includes dealing with climate change. Right now, there are thousands of clean technology companies manufacturing innovative products that will help fundamentally shift our country away from carbon-intensive energy sources. Many of these are small business owners and entrepreneurs. My district of Sacramento has over 220 such companies. I've seen firsthand the progress they have made in solar, wind, hydrogen fuel cells, and waste-to-energy conversion techniques. These companies are working on cutting-edge technology to ensure that America remains a leader in green energy global market. We're rapidly losing ground in the sector to countries like China and Germany, who are heavily investing in the renewable energy markets, and the U.S. must level the playing field to allow our clean technology companies to better compete. Low-carbon energy sources must have a seat at this table. Energy efficiency must have a seat at this table. And clean energy technology must have a seat at this table. Anything less is short-sighted and detrimental to our economy, our environment, and our energy goals. I want to follow up to Ranking Member Rush's questions regarding the clean energy manufacturing sector. Last month, Chairman Emeritus John Dingell and I introduced H.R. 400, which is a bill to promote American clean energy exports and increase clean energy manufacturing. This bill passed the House with bipartisan support during the 111th Congress, and it's my hope that this committee will consider it soon. Ms. Morgan, can you expand on the economic benefits we would receive by boosting our clean energy manufacturing sector?
Certainly. I think one key piece, if we're able and hopefully will build out our manufacturing sector, would be in the area of jobs. Currently, according to the Energy and Environment Study Institute, you have more jobs created in clean energy than you do in oil, fossil, and coal combined. And a recent study by the University of California actually looked at the fact that you can, over time, if you were to really go for 30% renewables and push your energy efficiency in the economy, you could have 4 million jobs by 2030. So the job benefits are certainly significant, that's for sure.
Okay, and in your testimony, one of your recommendations is that we must build out America's renewable energy sector. Now, what are some criteria that policymakers should consider for driving clean energy growth and competitiveness?
I think the main criteria right now, if I look at where the United States stands on clean energy, is the clear, long-term, long, loud, and legal signal that investors are looking for to see that this is a growing area. So that means that national renewable energy policy, I think it can take many different forms, but optimally one that goes beyond 3 years. I think certainly having grid access for those renewable energy is another key criteria that I would look for. And I would add in training. I think the other piece that's very important, Colorado is doing some work on this, and that's happening in Germany, is a really specific training program, big job opportunities.
Okay, and do you think we need to consider creative financing options for smaller clean energy companies to succeed?
Definitely. I mean, I think that if you look at, there's a number of different innovative ways that you can bundle the demand for renewable energy and create new financing mechanisms to do that. We've had some experience of that in the U.S., and we're now seeing that happening in India as well.
Thank you. And I also believe, too, as we look forward, we're not, because of my focus on clean energy technology does not at all mean that we cannot look at the transitional aspects of things like natural gas, as long as I believe we look at some of the areas of carbon capture and storage, which I think needs to be looked at alongside the wonderful aspects of how much gas we have. So anyway, I really appreciate your testimony, and I hope that we can continue the conversation on looking at somewhat all of the above as we move forward. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel for coming to Mr. Szymanski and Dr. Yergin, and actually Hutzler and I can't see the name, and we don't have paper anymore, so Vitus. I have to go flip back on this iPad to find the testimony a couple times. Because in your presentation, a lot of you have the maps and the various plays, whether it be the shale, tight oil, coal bed, others, in your testimony. What I'd like to know is how far behind are we from the pipeline infrastructure to move this product? I mean, the pipeline issue we're dealing with the Keystone and Keystone XL. Part of the North Dakota play is the problem is we don't have access to a pipeline, so a lot of this North Dakota oil is being inefficiently trucked down versus through pipelines. So can you all just briefly talk about pipeline infrastructure?
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. So just to start, the infrastructure issues take time. I mean, you can often get some production going, and you get a lot of wells being drilled. Whether or not companies can then afford to build the pipeline infrastructure to move those products, oil and gas, around depends on their own view about how long the production activity will last.
If you just be a little brief, because most of the pipeline infrastructure now is based upon traditional oil and gas and refineries and the like. So all these new plays are in areas where there may not be access to. So
exactly.
I guess the point is that something we ought to consider in public policy debates? Dr. Yergin?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, it's like I said, our thinking needs to catch up with reality. Our logistics need to catch up with new production. Everything's been turned upside down. Instead of going south-north, it's going north-south. Big question, we just managed to save those refineries on the East Coast, but they have to be hooked into the North Dakota. We see, as you say, trucking. We see railroad cars. Ultimately, the most efficient way to move these supplies is by pipeline. Canada's output of oil sands is equivalent to Libya's before the revolution there. That supply, we talk about U.S. energy independence. It's really a North American integration. So we've got to get our a pipeline system that catches up with the fact that technology's changed.
There's also some oil being barged down on the Mississippi, and there was a recent they ran into the bridge down in the southern part of the lower Miss.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's also issues with that type of transportation. Ms. Hutzler?
Yes, I agree with Dr. Yergin. We do have oil that's landlocked in North Dakota. We have buildup in our storage facilities in Cushing, and it is more efficient to move by pipeline. We're moving by rail now. I think I saw a number of 800,000 barrels a day, which is pretty substantial. And it's also safer to move it by rail than by pipeline than rail.
Mr. Vitus?
I agree with the other speakers that the oil and natural gas infrastructure that's going to be needed to move this oil and gas to market is very important, and it involves a substantial investment each year and thousands of miles of pipe. The other point that I would emphasize as well is that pipelines in general tend to be the least expensive and usually the safest way to transport both gas and oil.
Thank you. And just I'll just finish with Dr. Yergin. This whole debate on slowing down or not exporting natural gas I find pretty problematic, as natural gas is just a basic commodity product, just like corn or beans or pork or anything else. And that it has to be priced on the world market, and we have to get it. You mentioned in your comment that there's a need for additional markets. Why did you say that, and what do you mean by that?
Well, because we've seen, has been described by my colleagues in this panel, this growth, this technology has opened up a huge amount of new supply, and right now, there's a lot of supply that can't get to market, and you see activity going down.
So if there's no price signal, then all these jobs for location discovery and recovery would be gone because
Right.
there's no price signal to continue to.
Yeah, what's happened is, of course, a lot of it's flipped into looking for either oil or for gas that's rich with liquids. But nevertheless, I think it's the general view is that at this low level, that this is not a sustaining price to maintain the growth in supply that we need for electric power, that we need for our industry, that we might need for transportation and to meet global markets.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. At this time, I recognize the gentlelady from Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for this hearing as well. Mr. Szymanski, I represent a U.S. territory, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they are plagued with the highest rates of electricity in the United States. In my district of the U.S. Virgin Islands, current electricity rates are 5 times the national average. An average family pays, if they can, 5.8 cents per kilowatt, compared to the 9.83 U.S. average. A visit to your website shows a very clear breakdown of state electricity profiles with U.S. average retail price reported. But in order to find information about the territories, you have to really search, and it's quite confusing. The majority of information is on a beta site that's there. It says for public testing and comment only. And there's a country analysis brief on the Virgin Islands, but this is really unacceptable. So why is it that the territory's electricity cost information is not included there, even if it's as an outlier, and what can we do to have that information included?
Thank you, Congresswoman Christensen. I said at my confirmation hearings that EIA needed to get its data better, faster, and cheaper, and we're working on that. We need to receive complete and timely data from everybody. This has been a problem with some of the territories, but I will look into that question and I'll see what we can do.
And we can work to try to make sure that you have the information also.
Be happy to do that.
It's important for that information to be out there. Thank you. We've spent a lot of time talking today about oil and gas resources, but the U.S., as has been said by Ms. Morgan and others, that we're blessed with ample renewable energy resources as well. The question is whether we and the rest of the world are doing enough, quickly enough, to develop those clean energy resources and make our economies more energy efficient. Last November, the IEA released their World Energy Outlook for 2012 and found that our current energy system is unsustainable. And they projected that in a little more than 20 years, we could see average global temperatures increase up to 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit, as approximately 80% of future global emissions are already locked in by existing infrastructure. Ms. Morgan, how much would we have to reduce fossil fuel use in order to prevent more than I think that would be 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperature, and what does it mean that we would be locked into these emissions?
Thank you. Well, on the longer term, what the scientific estimates state is that we need to be reducing our emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050, which means that we have to really have the longer term in mind. The estimates for 2020 time period for developed countries tends to be around a 25 to 40% reduction. The United States has made a commitment of 17%. I think the thing to recognize is that there are points of no return where we hit tipping points, where you're no longer able to restore coral reefs, where the Arctic ice melts completely. Those are the types of irreversible impacts, and the lock-in of our infrastructure that comes from the current pathway on high carbon is very much responsible for that.
And they also say that it's possible to prevent that 2-degree centigrade increase if we were to act to reduce CO2 emissions prior to 2017. So I don't know if you wanted to comment, and Mr. Saminsky wanted to comment on what is it that, the window we have is rapidly closing. It hasn't closed yet, but the IEA has said that it's ambitious but still possible. So what is it that we would have to do? What kind of technology should be included in this rapid development and deployment policy if we could reduce that increase, in order to reduce that increase by 2017?
I'll answer quickly, and then I think the key points are we have to have a revolution in the renewable energy space and energy efficiency. We have these technologies now. We need to put in place the policy frameworks and the R&D to get those going. We need to price carbon. Most other major economies around the world price carbon. It drives efficiency, and we need very much to drive R&D much more quickly. Mr.
It's only 5 years.
I won't make any policy recommendations, but I'd like to point out that this is a global issue. So to deal with the 2-degree centigrade, we need cooperation around the world. EIA's forecasts show that almost all of the growth in carbon dioxide emissions from energy will be taking place in the non-OECD countries, so outside of the developed world. So what we really need is to help countries like China and India move towards lower carbon fuels.
I think one other thing just to add is our CO2 emissions from energy consumption are down 13% since 2007. So this is already actually happening. And the other thing that we can do that has a huge impact is simply become more energy efficient. We're twice as energy efficient as a nation as we were a few decades ago. We have technologies and tools to do that today, and that's the big thing. But as Adam Saminsky says, the growth is in the emerging markets, and those numbers tend to overwhelm what we're doing.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Time is up.
Time's up. This time I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Burgess, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for convening this panel. It really has been a fascinating morning. I'm going to start off this new session of Congress by agreeing with the ranking member of our committee. In his opening statement, he said we must not betray our children and our future generations. I agree with him. Now, while he was referencing carbon capture and storage, I would reference the economic conditions that have prevailed for the past 4 or 5 years. The last 2 Congresses, I was also on the Joint Economic Commission. It was our duty the first Friday of every month to receive from the Bureau of Labor Statistics the employment numbers from the previous month. And you saw a pattern emerging through all of that bad news. And there was a lot of bad news during those years. But mining and manufacturing always led that list of new job creation. Now, we see this morning Forbes magazine is reporting that 4 out of the top 10 best places to live in the world are in Texas. I knew that. They didn't need to tell me, but Austin leads the list, followed by Houston second, Dallas third, San Antonio ninth. In fact, the state of Texas has added almost 500,000 people over the past years from last summer to summer of 2011 to the summer of 2012. And the reason for that, of course, is the availability of energy and the cost of energy. And while energy in and of itself cannot be its own end, it does help drive our economy. So when we talk about not wanting to betray our children and future generations, I think we have a responsibility to the economy, and part of that responsibility is the energy supply that's available to our economy. Dr. Christensen talked about tipping points. I will just ask an open-ended question. I know you guys don't like to speculate, but what kind of tipping point would we have seen with the economy of the last 4 or 5 years in the absence of shale? What might have happened to our economy without the ability to produce this energy and produce these jobs? And either Dr. Yergin or the Honorable Szyminski would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, if we had remained on the track that we had been on prior to when we were going to build all those LNG receiving stations, we'd probably be spending $100 billion a year now to import LNG into the country, so that would have been a big burden. Secondly, had we not seen this increase, this substantial increase in oil production, as I said, this equivalent to Iran's total exports before sanctions, we'd be paying a lot higher prices for oil. And it would be a much tighter and more vulnerable market, and we would not have had what we've seen is that the supply chains are so long in our economy.
Right.
These are dollars that stay here, that go into jobs here, rather than going into a sovereign wealth fund somewhere else in the world. So in that other universe, it would have been a much more difficult picture and more congruent with what seemed to be the picture in front of people in 2008.
Yes, sir.
There's virtually every economic study that I've seen suggests that higher domestic production of fuels leads to greater GDP. When you get to the import issue, you obviously have lower trade deficit. All of that helps the economy, leads to greater job creation, as Dr. Yergin said. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that the availability of relatively low-cost natural gas has actually, I believe, helped to sustain some of the growth in wind and solar on the renewable side, because those are intermittent sources. They need a backup supply, and it's often natural gas that provides the backup for these rapidly growing renewables that are going to become a fairly significant part of U.S. energy production and consumption.
Sure. We have peaking plants in North Texas where in the summertime, when the air conditioners are all cranked down low, even if you had a substantial wind component, you'd never be able to keep up with that peak demand. I just got to tell you, this is such a different hearing than we had in this very room in 2008. And I mean, it's good news. It's good news for the American people. It's good news for the American economy, regardless of political party or political persuasion. This is a good news hearing. The other part of good news, and Mr. Vitas, I don't want to leave you out down in the end. Yesterday, flying up here, reading in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and the concept of having an environmentally friendly fracking fluid that is being developed now by Halliburton in Texas. I understand other companies are doing that as well, but the technology is changing, and it's changing in a way that is environmentally responsible. You referenced some of that in your testimony, but do you have additional thoughts on that?
Yes, what I said was there are several ways in which the industry has tried to adapt their technologies to reduce the footprint of drilling these wells. One is the surface footprint, and trying to reduce the amount of space that it takes by combining multiple wells on a single pad, and that can reduce the amount of space used by a factor of 8. The other point that I made is in the drilling fluids themselves, which in the old days had been formulated with diesel oil, that has almost totally been eliminated now, and some of the toxic substances in the frac fluids are being replaced by more environmentally benign fluids. And then the other point that has been raised is the use of water itself. Typically, a well will take about 3 million gallons in terms of the fracking process. And one of the ways the industry is reducing that is by recycling the water and being able to use it over and over again. And the other thing that they've been doing is trying to reduce the total amount of water used by various different techniques, including substituting other fluids such as CO2, nitrogen, and in some cases propane instead of water.
The gentleman's time is expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This time recognize the ranking member, Mr. Waxman from California, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that we've made great advances, and it is a reason for celebration. We ought to be very pleased with the advantages that come to us with the production of more oil and gas resources. And we now have advances in technology that have allowed us to drill in many new areas. But as we congratulate ourselves for these new discoveries, We also, I think, need to discuss how energy choices we're making today will have long-term impacts for our climate. Scientists agree we have a rapidly diminishing window to act to reduce our carbon pollution before the catastrophic impacts of climate change are irreversible. Ms. Morgan, in your testimony, you say the United States cannot and should not make energy decisions without factoring in the risks associated with climate change. This committee is charged with developing energy policy for the United States. Ms. Morgan, how should this committee factor in climate when making energy policy?
Well, I think that if you look longer term, it's quite important. First of all, you need to take into account the intensity, the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuels you're looking at, and you need to put a price on those fuels in order to drive innovation and energy efficiency. That's point one. The second point, I think, is that although our emissions of CO2 have reduced extensively, which is very good news, they are plateauing out. And emissions of methane and other gases are increasing. So that means that we need to put in place mandatory and voluntary approaches to reduce methane emissions as well. And we need a very solid renewable energy approach. The countries that are moving forward, you see those kind of three pieces in there. Carbon pricing, renewable energy policy, energy efficiency standards are all quite important. And then support mechanisms around those to make them work.
I've been on this committee for a number of decades, and I remember the period of time when we decided that we'll continue to subsidize the fossil fuels through not requiring them to pay their external costs, and in some cases directly through the tax code. And we undermined the alternatives that could have made us less dependent on these fossil fuels, which made us, of course, more dependent on Saudi Arabia and Iran and other countries that were the OPEC countries that held us hostage. We made a mistake not diversifying our energy sources at that time. We should develop our energy policy under this new circumstance that doesn't make the same mistakes and put us all in the same situation where we'll look back and regret that we didn't recognize that our energy policy had to be more thought through. What are the potential economic repercussions if we fail to integrate climate risks with our energy policy making?
I think that there are three main risks. I think the first really is around stranded investments, because I think companies today that are investing in high carbon infrastructure without putting in place the mechanism to deal with CO2 are being short-sighted, and that as climate change unfortunately gets worse and policies get put in place, those will be stranded investments. And if we wait to act, those will likely be more expensive as we go forward. The second really is missing out on new and existing markets around the world, which are growing exponentially. You're looking at up to $7 trillion in new capital in renewables by 2030. So there's national policies in every other major economy in the world on renewables. They're serious about this. They're moving forward for a range of reasons. And the third are the impacts actually on our infrastructure itself and on the country, which, as you know, as the EIA said, if we keep going the way we're going, you're looking at a 10.8 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature, which is unprecedented in our time.
Dr. Yergin, aside from the investment we ought to be making in looking at alternative energy sources, renewables, efficiency, some of that research is threatened by the budget cuts that members want to make. Do you think we ought to develop a policy that looks at the environmental consequences of where we're going in energy development?
I think so. I think it's there. In the 1990s, I headed a task force on energy R&D for the Department of Energy, and I think one of the things that I found, we found very distressing was this volatility in spending on R&D. And whether you're talking about, MIT, where more people are working on solar than anything else, or advances in drilling or whatever it is, I think that a sustained commitment to R&D is the most important investment.
I absolutely agree with you. But aside from that, do you think we ought to make policies in the energy area that look at not just the research, but the consequences to the future in reducing carbon emissions?
Well, I think so. I think environmental considerations are obviously and should be part of how you make energy policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy.
Mr. Yergin, there are those who say that we shouldn't export liquefied natural gas because in some way by doing so we will promote the production of more natural gas and therefore contribute to global warming. But what you're saying is that is absurd because if we don't do it, Australia or Canada or some other country will export liquefied natural gas. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think people will fill the market and fill the need, and in fact are racing ahead to do that.
Now, as they race ahead, it's fair to say that if it's a $5 billion or $10 billion project to create one of these export terminals, those are a heck of a lot of jobs that will be sacrificed because of an absurd premise. Again, is that a fair statement?
The absurd premise is that
being that if we don't export liquefied natural gas, then then natural gas will not be mined.
Right. Well, I think in fact, if you take a country like China, which, as Adam Szyminski pointed out, is very heavily oriented towards coal and wants to reduce its use of coal and use more natural gas to produce electricity to reduce pollution. They'll look in one direction or another, and if we're sending natural gas, we would be contributing to their reducing their pollution.
So if we can create those jobs, we will simultaneously improve our economy, but decrease carbon release worldwide potentially.
Yeah, I think what's happening now is...
okay, I'm going to let you hold that.
Okay, good, sorry.
Mr. Szyminski, in 2007, you published a report at the request of Congress demonstrating subsidies for different sources of fuel. And at that time, biofuels got $5.72 per million BTU subsidy from the government. Solar got $2.82. Coal got 4 cents per million BTU, and natural gas got 3 cents per million BTU. Your updated report did not have this chart, but when we speak about subsidies for various forms of energy, there's an order of magnitude difference here. Is that still the ballpark of the federal subsidies?
I'd have to look at the numbers, Congressman, but the number of assumptions and factors that you have to take into consideration to do those calculations are numerous and complex. But I think it's fair to say that in addition to fossil fuel subsidies, that there obviously are also subsidies on renewable fuels and many of the other things that we do.
Yeah, like 100-fold, huh? 100-fold going to the renewables. Mr. Yergin, back to you. When you're at the World Economic Summit, you're right. If we don't send energy to Japan, their economy will tank. That's on my mind when I go around to the exporters in Louisiana. I say, what do you need to create more American jobs? They say more robust markets to export to. Right now, Japan and Europe are in the doldrums. We need those economies to do better so we can create more American jobs. So is it fair to say, let me ask, at the World Economic Summit, what is the prognosis for the Japanese economy as an example if they cannot replace their nuclear capability with some reasonable...
Well, they've turned, with the new government in Japan is going to reconsider, and I think in July is going to come out with its policy about whether it's going to keep some of the plants operating or not. With that said, the Japanese are kind of in a panic about energy supplies right now, very focused on LNG as their kind of major increment. And I think the point you say, a Japanese economy that's a weak economy is part of a global economy and contributes to global weakness. So we're pretty interdependent with them. That's why I said they're a close ally, and if they do well, we do better.
It is in our self-interest to make sure that they have adequate energy supply.
That's right, and it's in our political interest and it's in our economic interest.
Okay, sounds great. Ms. Morgan, you spoke about methane emissions. I think it's important to make sure the record is straight. A lot of times folks who are critical of natural gas state that quote that Cornell study, Mr. Howarth's study, in which finds very high levels of methane release with natural gas production. But just to set the record straight, that's kind of an outlier study, isn't it? I mean, both the Department of Energy as well as an MIT peer-reviewed study have found a tenth of the emissions as the Howarth study. Is that a fair statement?
We're actually in the process of putting out a study on this. We think that that study is on the upper end.
The Howarth study is on the upper end.
Yep. Yeah. And but that there are also real measures that can be put in place to control methane, even on the lower level, that are important.
Mr. Jurgen?
Just to add, I know my colleagues, the Howarth study used data that supposedly came from us, and my colleagues had written a letter to the journal in which was published saying the data had been quite distorted. And there is now a cooperative program with the Environmental Defense Fund and a number of companies to actually measure methane and come out with some hard data on it.
I just say that because, Ms. Morgan, your testimony suggested that the life cycle carbon release of natural gas is not as favorable as we would presume, but that really seems to assume the Howarth study is valid, and frankly, there seems to be a general agreement that it is not.
I think even on the lower levels, it is important to put in place measures to deal
Well,
with
I'm not arguing that.
Right.
I'm just saying the life cycle release has been overstated.
the life cycle as a whole. That study does overstate it.
Yeah, okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your insightful testimony. The outlook from the Energy Information Agency is very positive for the economy, and I think beyond the current outlook, there is great potential for additional economic growth tied to domestic supplies if we have the appropriate environmental safeguards. And I think here in America, we can do more for consumers and for electric reliability from all energy sources. But in order to build that more sustainable energy system, we need to bring greater balance between fossil fuels and renewable sources. And I don't think it's all about generating energy from cleaner sources. We also need to make our economy more efficient so that we use less energy overall. And I think that it may be time to look at the business models for utilities and the incentives and modernizing those business models. According to the IEA, energy efficiency is an enormous unrealized opportunity for the world to reduce energy use and thereby carbon pollution. The IEA projects that 2/3 of potential efficiency gains will remain untapped through 2035 under current policies. That's a real hit on the pocketbooks of American families and businesses. Ms. Morgan, in your testimony, you say the United States has immense remaining potential for improving efficiency in its industrial, transportation, and building sectors. Which energy efficiency measures have the most potential to reduce energy consumption from the U.S. Industrial sector?
I think there are a number of different measures, and they can come in on either a state level or on a national level. There's tremendous potential of combined heat and power on the state level for industrial facilities. In the building sector, certainly also you look at both the opportunity for new business models, but also for jobs in retrofitting buildings. There's great potential there. And certainly, you know, the evidence base is quite strong if you look at the benefits that have come from the new car standards that have been put in place.
Can you give me some more specific examples or the most innovative energy measures in use today? Are there energy efficiency measures being implemented at the state level or abroad that we should expand or employ on a national level?
There's a program actually in Germany that is very focused on the retrofitting of buildings. And there you need very clearly to look at the ownership structure, obviously. But they're looking at how you can get at the point that the owner and the renter don't always share the benefits, and looking at new models of how they can put in place measures to retrofit those buildings extensively across the country. They are funding that actually with revenue from their emissions trading system. So it's not additional funding coming in. I think that's a very strong example. You actually have a very strong program in China around their enterprises as well, where they're putting in place measures to share practices and set targets for companies to increase their efficiency.
And in your written testimony, you state that the federal government can play an important role in improving energy efficiency across the economy. You said the first step is to support programs that ensure consumers can make make informed choices. What were you talking about? What else can the Congress do to encourage consumers to make energy efficient choices in the marketplace?
Well, I think there's things like smart metering, information provided both in all products that is much clearer about energy saved, money saved, CO2 saved. There's ways when you start looking at our grid on the smart metering side of things. I think if consumers, first of all, have more information, but then also, can be able to buy the top runner products as affordably as possible, then those are good.
Wouldn't it help if then the electric utilities really had an incentive to promote conservation and greater efficiency? They would help empower consumers to do that. It would be a win for families. They'd have more money to spend at home, and the utilities would, their business would change a little bit. For example, in my neck of the woods, we have this terrible debacle with a broken nuclear power plant, and it is enormously expensive. And we like the diversity in power supply. It's very important. But it seems now that we'd get more bang for the buck if we helped save energy and the utility had some incentive. Where is that happening? Are those discussions happening?
Yeah, they're happening somewhat on the state level, I think, in certain states where you have these kind of demand-side management models that are put together where both utilities and consumers benefit. I think they need to be much more broadened out so that they occur across the country more systematically.
Do any of you have information on those kind of incentives or changing the business model?
I could just add very quickly that the lighting standards that have been put in place starting this year, changes in appliance efficiency, the improvements in auto fuel efficiency, lower vehicle miles traveled, all of that is leading to lower energy use per capita, which is good. You're getting more value for less consumption. Quickly, the difference between the new auto fuel efficiency standards that got adopted last year, so between 2012 and 2013 in our forecasts, by the year 2035, that's worth something like 1.5 million barrels a day of oil imports.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome to the witnesses. I thank you for your time and expertise as we lay the groundwork for a broader discussion about federal energy policy and the importance of a robust domestic energy industry. I want to dig a little deeper into the geopolitical challenges we're facing in the new energy era. As we move forward as a nation, we need to better understand how our newly realized energy resources can advance our foreign policy goals. One historic example of how U.S. energy production, or lack thereof, impacts the geopolitical landscape, the Persian Gulf. At the end of World War II, our geopolitical focus was on containing communism. When I joined the Navy in 1989, we had 4 numbered fleets: the 2nd Fleet in the Atlantic, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean Sea, the 3rd Fleet in the Eastern Pacific, and the 7th Fleet in the Western Pacific in Japan. Communism fell in 1991, and as a result, our global military forces changed dramatically. We added the 5th Fleet in the Persian Gulf. We disestablished the 2nd Fleet in the Western Pacific in September of 2011, and the 7th Fleet has now become the largest fleet in our Navy, and it's ramping up very quickly with China's aggression in the South China Sea. American innovation and our abundant energy resources can and should be leveraged to protect our allies around the world from unreliable and unfriendly regimes and promote our interests. Another example of how U.S. energy supply can strengthen our relationships with important countries is India. They are the world's largest democracy, and they're in a pretty unreliable neighborhood. They got Pakistan to the west, China to the north, Bangladesh to the east. I had lunch with the Indian Consul General in Houston a couple weeks ago. We spoke for 20 minutes about India getting U.S. compressed LNG, export natural gas to India. Right now they've got a big problem. They have no pipelines. Because they're neighbors, they can't have overland pipelines. So all of their energy supply has to come in the form of oil or gas, has to come either via train or via boat, mostly boat. They want to be our partner. And so my question for you, Dr. Yergin, in your view, how can our energy resource base reshape our foreign policy objectives? What countries should we develop our strength and our ties with? And how can we pressure rogue states without relying on military intervention?
Well, that's a big question. I think that first we are seeing, as we've been describing, a rebalancing of global oil that's occurring, and that we'll see the Western Hemisphere largely self-sufficient in years to come, and more of the oil from the Middle East going to the Far East. So I think that's kind of one of the fundamental changes. I think what you refer to with India, I found when I was in Asia recently, in Singapore and other countries, also that interest in seeing the U.S. as at least a player as an energy exporter, if not a massive one, because for them it's diversification, and they'd like to actually be more reliant and diversified to depend upon the United States. I think as these technologies develop and we see it develop elsewhere, I mean, a key country actually is what Mexico does in terms of opening itself up to these new technologies is something that I think is like right on the foreground. In terms of new relationships, Brazil is on course to be a global energy powerhouse, and I think the U.S.-Brazilian relationship is one that grows in significance for us. So those would be some of the changes.
How about Eastern Europe, who buys their natural gas largely from Russia?
Well, Poland is very interested in, it's interesting, you have different mixes in Europe on policy. Poland certainly wants to develop its shale gas to reduce its dependence on Russian gas. And Ukraine, of course, there's constant friction between Russia and Ukraine over the price of natural gas. And Ukraine, I think just last week or the week before, started signing some large agreements to develop shale gas in Ukraine. And for them, it's not only economic, but it's also a geopolitical development.
I get emails back home every week from people along the Silk Road, you know, where Turkey starts and runs sort of heads east towards all into India. All those countries right there, the former Soviet states up there on the Caspian Sea, they want our natural gas. So again, I think it's a great opportunity for our country to actually have an influence with these people, make some friends, create American jobs, and again.
Well, and I think they want to be integrated in the global markets as a way to sustain their nationhood.
Yes, sir. Well, it looks like I'm out of time. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. This morning we're discussing a new landscape for North America's energy resources and how we develop an effective energy policy in the absence of resource scarcity. In my home state of Western Pennsylvania, especially in Western Pennsylvania where I represent, we're experiencing a surge in energy development that each of you have discussed in your testimony. In my neck of the woods, we have natural gas, coal, nuclear. We've got steel workers making wind turbines. We've got universities producing energy startups that are harnessing renewables. Marcellus Shale alone in my state has provided thousands of new jobs, and we're burning a cleaner fuel for our transportation and electric industry. So it's important to me that policymakers fully understand energy reserves that we have and the best ways to develop them. But something that's equally important to me is how we manage the effects of carbon emissions that come from burning these resources. I've worked many years on this committee. This is my 13th year on the committee and the 19th year in Congress to do this in a comprehensive way. And I think most of the members of this committee knows that I want to get our fossil fuel resources out of the ground. I don't think it has to be an either-or proposition. But what I'm interested in is how we find that sweet spot where we can develop North American energy resources and effectively manage our carbon emissions simultaneously. So I have some questions about that, but before I ask those questions, I just want to provide some clarity to something that we heard at this hearing, and we hear a lot. My good friend, Mr. Scalise, and he is my good friend, had asked Ms. Hutzler why we aren't seeing more development on federal lands, and her reply was that the permitting process takes up to 300 days. I want to put a map up on the screen that I think we have that I think should provide a little bit of clarity. As you look at the United States, that dark area, the gray shaded area, that's the federal lands, and the light red, the pinkish area, is where our oil and gas shale plays are. And then the dark red that you see is where there's an overlap of federal lands and oil and gas shale plays. And Mr. Szymanski, I think back in August, you testified to this committee that because basically the shale resource basins are largely outside of the federal lands, so too is the shale production. I think your quote was, in this case, the geology is working in favor of non-federal landowners. So we hear this a lot, that, you know, there's all this development that could be taking place on federal lands, but the permitting process is so bad. And I think the map pretty graphically illustrates that there's just not much federal lands where the oil and gas shale plays are in the United States. I just wanted to provide that for clarification. I want to ask Dr. Yergin and Ms. Hutzler, too. You both briefly addressed climate change and greenhouse gases in your written testimonies. And I just wonder, as we start to reassess these vast new energy resources, and it's not that they're new, we find, you know, technology has given us a way to make them economically feasible to go and recover them now, right? And everything we do is a technology question, whether it's how we dispose of nuclear waste, what do we do with carbon emissions, just all of this. The answer is in technologies, and we're discovering new ways to do things in a more environmentally sound way. We hear about new types of fracking fluids because there's this tremendous potential to get this out of the ground. And I guess my question is don't you, I'm interested here, do you believe that we should also factor in climate change and these environmental concerns? Because it seems to me that once industries and you know, have to address these carbon issues too, we're going to see technology innovations there also that are going to be very valuable to U.S. companies to help these these economies like in China and India and others. They're not going to be the leaders in figuring out how to deal with carbon emissions. That's going to hopefully come here, and then we're going to sell that technology all over the world. So I guess what I want to ask you is, do you think we should factor this in as we're looking at a new energy policy and these new fuels, factoring in environmental concerns and climate change as we develop policy?
I think we're certainly factoring them in. As I said, I spent some time on that Secretary of Energy Advisory Board committee that I think provided a framework for looking at the environmental questions and saying, how do you address them? And there's climate change, but there's also the water questions. What do you do about wastewater? Questions that you know very well from your district that need to be addressed. I think that as we've just discussed, the understanding the methane emissions from natural gas drilling is a very important contribution to it. There are different views as to what the results will be. And I'd say that the other thing is that you have to see this in an entirety. It's not that we're going to use more oil because we're producing oil, but it means our cars, as Adam says, are going to get a lot more efficient as we do it. But the question is that oil going to be produced in the United States, or are we going to import it? So we have to see it in a framework.
I want to address your map again, and maybe that is the case for the shale formations. But on the other hand, the federal government has a lot of non-shale based areas that it could be
But all the growth
permitting.
is in the I mean, the boom we're seeing right now is happening because we figured out how to get this oil and gas out of shale.
Well, let's take the offshore area in terms of oil drilling. We were drilling a lot. As a matter of fact, the oil numbers offshore in FY 2010 were very high, but then it dropped by 17%. So you can still get a lot of oil offshore if you allow the permitting to go on.
Yeah, the point I want, we're seeing this huge boom in oil and gas shale, and it's basically exists on non-federal land, so I just think it's somewhat of a red herring.
Gentleman's
Mr.
time.
Chairman, I see my time's up.
This time recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for showing today. And if I could have that last slide put up on the screen again, that would be fantastic. If you look at the state of Colorado as it appears on the map that is right there, you can see the state of Colorado. That red spot is in my district in northern Colorado, but there's tremendous opportunity for development in the gray spots. And a lot of that gray spot that you see in Colorado or the Rocky Mountain areas, it's BLM land, it's U.S. Forest Service land. They're unable to get permits through the BLM because of various bureaucracies. In fact, according to the Western Energy Alliance, over 100,000 jobs could be created in the western United States, primarily on those gray lands, if the permitting delays were simply lifted. Over 100,000 jobs could be created in the western United States. That's not because all the development's taken place in the red areas or the pink areas. That's because the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies have been so slow in their permitting that we can't get those permits through to create those kinds of jobs. So I think you'd see a lot more red areas if we could actually get a government that was willing to allow us access to those resources in a responsible manner. And so I, for one, would like to see over 100,000 jobs being created in the western United States. But I'd also like to ask a couple of other questions, pointing out that in that red area, you see in northern Colorado right there, because of that development that's taking place in that play, there was an article in the Greeley Tribune on January 17th that said, the Greeley Tribune's the newspaper in northern Colorado, that said Weld County rose 20 spots in a year to rank number 42 in the nation in job and wage growth. There was an article in the same newspaper, January 8th of 2013, that said Weld County wage growth hits number 5 in the nation because of, in great part, the energy development that's taking place in Colorado. So we can see the opportunities, and I believe it was Ms. Hutzler that talked about the amount of economic impact that we have seen. I think your statement, what was it again that you said about the $1 trillion over 30 years? What was the amount of money you said as a result of development?
If we opened up new areas onshore and offshore to development, that we would get over the next 37 years $14.4 trillion to the economy.
And I believe the President's budget said that if we had, and I'm going to get this number in the ballpark, if we had 1% GDP growth over the next 10 years, we would generate around $2 billion or so in new revenues for the federal government. And so you can see the kind of activity that GDP growth we would see, the kind of GDP growth we would see as a result of energy development across the country. Ms. Hutzler, you mentioned the permitting delays on federal land. What do we need to do in order to alleviate those delays?
We need to make the process more streamlined. We need to get rid of all the red tape and the delays and look at the states to see how they're doing it to remove those delays, or in fact allow the states to actually do the permitting, because they certainly know the geologic areas and what's best for the state.
Ms. Morgan, you had said something in your statement regarding 2050 carbon emissions. Is that the reducing carbon emissions by 80% by 2050? 20% of today's carbon emissions would be what, about $1 billion tons of CO2? Is that roughly what it would be if?
That's roughly, yeah.
Okay. Can you give me an emissions inventory of for 2050 of specific sources that would add up to 1 billion tons in CO2?
In 2050?
Yeah, a specific inventory of emissions.
Well, I can certainly,
Does the technology exist today to do that?
Question. Yes, it does exist today. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory actually said you can get to the 80% renewables by 2050 with existing technologies. What the inventory would be then would be much less CO2. There would probably be a bit left over in some of the non-CO2 gases. But the point is that I think if we were to build out and put in place the policies, you can find that sweet spot of extracting our clean energy resources while also producing the gas in a more climate-friendly fashion.
And I think that's something that I have long been supportive of, is an effort to find a sweet spot when it comes to both renewable alternative energy sources as well as traditional energy sources. But unfortunately, what I see in Colorado, what I see out of this administration, are attempts to actually make it more difficult to develop that traditional resource. In fact, I was reading a letter from one of the EPA regions, I believe it was Region 3 of the EPA, concerning an LNG export facility, that they were asking how many new wells would have to be drilled across the country as a result of that one single LNG facility. And I think when we start asking those kinds of questions, what happens to this LNG facility to wells being drilled in Colorado, that seems to me to be a very adverse tone for energy production in this nation. And I see my time's expired, and I'll yield back.
This time I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for presenting this at this hearing. There's been a lot of discussion about the oil and gas production and the expanded estimates of domestic oil and gas reserves. And I believe there's most likely this gap between proven and technically recoverable reserves. To what degree, if any, have the environmental costs of exploiting oil and gas been considered in estimating the technically recoverable reserves? Anyone?
I can try to address that issue. In the work that we've done, we've defined the technically recoverable to be based on current technology and current activity. So we apply a factor of so many BCF or so many barrels per well based on what's going on right now. So it does not take into account future changes to regulations that might change the cost. However, when we look at the economically recoverable resource base, which is a subset of the technically recoverable, we have to make certain assumptions about the costs. So depending upon what kind of scenario we're looking at, we may use today's costs, which are based on today's environmental rules, or we may hypothesize new regulations that might be imposed in the future. And typically when we look at that, we would look at a series of different rules about water use, different types of materials that can be used, and so on. Generally, when we've looked at that, we would say that the future regulations might add something like 7% to the cost of a well. So that would produce then a resource cost that would be about 7% higher than today's cost. But of course, that depends on what regulations are implemented in the future.
Anyone else? Many of you did not respond, so I'm assuming there was no environmental costs. Ms. Morgan.
Yes, sir. I believe that environmental costs are actually not factored in, and we'd be happy to provide data from a recent National Academy of Sciences report on the climate and non-climate impacts that has a U.S. focus.
Right.
For the record.
I mean, the environmental, I mean, if the environmental costs, if you mean, for instance, regulations that require about how you manage water, how you manage land, how you manage air quality, those are all environmental costs that are then internalized because they're part of the regulatory process.
Well, Dr. Yergin, you discussed the implications of the expansion in gas production for our domestic markets and for the global market. The demand in the U.S. has leveled out recently, but global oil consumption continues to expand and fossil fuel use continues to expand. How do the rates of increase in our reserves compare to the rate of increase in oil and gas consumption globally?
Globally, the world's now divided into two. There's the OECD, the U.S., Western Europe, Japan, where we really started in about 2005, 2007 to have peak demand in terms of oil, and our oil consumption is going to go down, not up, because, as Adam said, more efficient cars, because of demographic changes in our population, because people reach a limit to how many hours they want to spend sitting in a car. So I think that's happening, but the great boom is, of course, in the emerging markets. And they're roughly now consume about the same amount of oil as the advanced markets, but that's where all the growth is going to be. China in 2000 sold 2 million new cars. We sold 17 million new cars. By 2010, we were selling 12 million new cars, and they were selling 17 million. So that tells you where the growth is going to be.
And the experiencing this period of relative abundance, but we've been there before in our recent past history. So oil and gas markets are volatile and have led us to a false sense of energy security in the past. So how do we develop a national energy policy that is less short-sighted and more strategic? And basically, how can we best use these reserves to maximize
well, I think I mean, what you said is quite right, that we've seen, after all, this is just a development of the last 3 or 4 years, and we were focused in this discussion on our resource base. But look at the Middle East. I mean, the people used to talk about the arc of instability going from Syria to Iran. Now they talk about it going from the Sahel in Africa to Central Asia. So I mean, you look at the map, and there are many parts of the world which have abundant energy supplies, but where there's a lot of very evident political risk. And so I think your point that we shouldn't, there's no reason here for complacency.
Yeah, Ms. Morgan, you were going to...
I just wanted to say that I think that if you look, we really can pull out all of our resources, that we don't need to be thinking of an either or. and that renewable energy resources, energy efficiency, and CCS are all part of that, and you need to take that longer-term view, or else we'll be making short-sighted decisions and not building the CCS in now onto our gas and oil decisions.
Thank you very much. And with that, I yield back. Chair.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have to say I think we have to use all of our energy resources to develop a plan long term. That being said, in regard to natural gas, Administrator Szymanski, you would expect at some point in the next few years for gas to return to $4. Is that correct?
We have natural gas prices getting back to $4 a million BTUs by the end of next year.
Okay. And in fact, they've been going up, and they hit a low in April of $1.95, and in December they were at $3.34. Is that correct?
I believe so, sir.
And if I understood your testimony earlier, when it gets to $4, coal becomes very competitive again?
It's a sliding scale, but as natural gas prices go higher, coal becomes more attractive.
I appreciate that very much coming from a coal district, and I will turn to you, Ms. Hutzler. A lot of what we've been doing has been ignoring coal and its potential as a major resource in this country. It's always been that way. And I would point out that I think in your testimony you said that we've relied on 3 major sources. Of course, we've got our renewables, but we also, our 3 major sources are nuclear, coal, and natural gas. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think you also reported that just the Mercury utility MAC rules would cost about $21 billion a year and $183,000 jobs a year. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that retirement of coal power plants, by 2016, we're going to be retiring 27 gigawatts. Is that also accurate?
I think that's through 2015, and that's an EIA number that's been reported to them by electric utility companies.
All right, and that's much higher than the EPA's estimates when they first came out with this new regulation. Isn't that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, not only is it going to affect jobs in the coal fields and at coal-fired power plants, but it also will cause our electric rates to go up by 10 to 20% in most of the country. Isn't that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in some parts in the Midwest, I don't represent them, but in some parts it could be right up there at the 20%.
Mm-hmm. And yes, in states that are highly dependent on coal-fired generation.
Now, you acknowledge in your written testimony that that the EPA claims that they're not going to do this, but you do raise some concern and worry that the EPA may decide that the modifications in regard to greenhouse gases could impact existing coal-fired power plants, because that would force them to, if they interpreted that complying with utility MACT created them to, into a new source, that would then put a tremendous amount of pressure on the existing coal-fired power plants and cause even more closures. Is that correct?
Yes, because under the utility MAC rule, if there are substantial changes, they might be able to look at that particular unit as a new unit and therefore treat it as a new unit where they don't want the amount of greenhouse gas emissions to be any more than from a natural gas plant, essentially.
And you cited a report from the United Mine Workers of America that would indicate that if that were to happen, that job losses could amount to more than 50,000 direct jobs if you count coal, utilities, and the railroad industry, and as much as 250,000 jobs indirect. Is that a correct assessment of what the UMWA said?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. So this is of great concern in my area because we have railroads, coal, and utility companies. I would point out also that it's kind of interesting that your written testimony indicates that the Chinese are using about 4 times as much coal as we are, and that while they're building cleaner plants, they're not putting their older, less clean plants out of existence in the meantime, are they?
No, they're not. With their GDP growth, they need all the power they can get. And in fact, according to the National Energy Technology Laboratory, they're building 60 to 80 gigawatts of coal-fired plants a year, and they think that'll happen easily through 2016 and maybe further.
And so they're relying on coal, including maybe even some of our coal, to generate their energy and the growth in their economy. Isn't that true?
Yes, they have to import coal now. They can't produce enough themselves to satisfy their demand, and we are exporting coal to them.
And so when I tell my constituents that not only are we damaging coal, but we're also damaging jobs in the United States, we're allowing the Chinese to grow their economy while retarding our economy by not using our clean coal technology. Isn't that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in my district, there's a plant that just opened this year that's extremely clean, and because of the carbon rules, the greenhouse gas rules, it wouldn't be allowed to be built if it hadn't already been under construction and then opened this year. Isn't that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so for all intents and purposes, at least at this point in history, there's not the technology available for the United States to build any more clean coal plants, coal-fired electric generation plants, and we're really handicapping ourselves in relationship to our competitiveness with the Chinese. Isn't that also true?
Yes, we don't, currently CCS technology is not available, commercially available for these plants. Mm-hmm.
All right, I thank you and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
This time I recognize the honorable gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Markey, for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman very much. Just a point, in 2009 in this committee and on the House floor, Mr. Waxman and I built in $60 billion for clean coal technology, carbon capture and sequestration. We voted it out of this committee with no Republican support. Over the last 5 years, unfortunately, coal has dropped from 51% down to 35% of all electrical generation in the country. And what has gone up? Natural gas. It's less expensive and it's cleaner. So coal is being attacked, but it's by the natural gas industry. So let's just get that clear. And we put the $60 billion in, and the coal industry opposed the Waxman-Markey bill. They opposed it. Now they suffer from not having the investment in technology to make it cleaner. So don't blame us. Okay? Blame the coal industry for not wanting the funding, and blame the natural gas industry for their technological breakthroughs, which have allowed for the production of more and cheaper and cleaner source of energy. Mr. Szymanski, recently the Department of Energy released a study of the economic impacts associated with exporting large quantities of natural gas that was performed by NERA Consulting. The study used outdated 2010 EIA projection data and concluded that while exports would lead to higher domestic energy prices and adverse impacts to American manufacturing, the overall economic impact would be positive. Mr. Szymanski, isn't it true that EIA's 2010 data predicted that domestic natural gas used in the power sector would decline between 2010 and 2020, though its use in the power sector has actually ended up growing by 27% just since 2010?
I've been in the forecasting business for a long time.
No, I'm just asking, is that true or not? I'm not asking for your personal history.
It's, yes.
Yes, okay, that's all you need to know. Yes, so way off. EIA was way off. It not only natural gas in the utility sector not only did not go down, it's now gone up 27% since that report. Isn't it true that EIA's current projections of natural gas use in the transportation sector are 7 times as high as the 2010 data used in the NERA study?
And our supply estimates are also higher.
I'm not asking you, I'm asking you to just go back to this study that is being relied upon. Is it not 7 times higher in the transportation sector than NERA projected in just 2010?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So this data was released in 2010, and since then, 100 major manufacturing projects totaling $95 billion in investment have been announced. These are manufacturing facilities that would produce chemicals, fertilizer, steel, aluminum, glass, tires, plastics, and other goods, all of which rely on cheap natural gas. That's what's driving this manufacturing. These announced projects alone would push U.S. industrial demand for natural gas 30% beyond the estimates used in the NERA study. Just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal described decisions made by German and Canadian companies to locate new facilities in the United States because of low natural gas prices. The Germans, the Canadians are coming to the United States with their manufacturing facilities. Do you believe that we should be making decisions about what to do with domestic natural gas in 2013 and beyond using data that reflected what was going on in that sector 3 years ago that vastly underestimated what is happening today?
I think it's always better to have recent and accurate data in making forecasts, but
especially since the data we're talking about is like a Frankie Avalon record, except it only took 3 years to turn it into completely outdated information that was totally wrong about where we'd be 3 years later.
Congressman Markey,
30 years later. Let me
as
just
I was
continue.
trying to say earlier.
Let me just continue.
Could I just answer your question, sir?
Last year, your agency found that exporting 12 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas could lead to a 54% increase in domestic prices. But today, companies are applying to export nearly 3 times that amount. It seems to me that before we permit more natural gas exports to occur, we should have an understanding of the potential economic impacts on consumers, on the manufacturing sector, and on the transportation sector in the United States in terms of our own internal domestic growth in those sectors of our economy, and have it based upon real data, not old data that bears no resemblance to what is happening in the natural gas sector today. Now, let me just ask this question. This panel, led by the Republicans, voted this in 2012 to repeal the ability of EPA to increase fuel economy standards for the vehicles which we drive. Let me just go down the line here and just ask each of you, do you support the repeal of the ability of the EPA to increase fuel economy standards, or do you oppose repealing the authority? Can we just go down and we'll just get your views on that way in which we deal with oil consumption in the United States? Mr. Semensky.
It's not a question for me, Congressman.
It's not?
No, it's not. It's a policy issue.
Okay, good. Mr. Yergin.
I think fuel efficiency standards are an important contribution to energy efficiency in our overall energy mix.
Thank you.
I agree. It's a great example of how you can meet energy and climate security goals at the same time.
Good. Thank you.
While they're important and certainly make a difference, you have to take a look at...
No, just that one issue. One issue, please.
Well, there's safety issues with vehicles and other issues that have to be taken into account.
You would consider repealing EPA authority?
I would think that it needs to study, and you have to look at a balanced situation.
Yes, yes, sir.
I don't want to state any policy decision opinions like that, but as a personal consumer of cars, I certainly like to have more efficient cars.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, thank you.
This time recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for coming in. Just a couple of questions, and this may not take all my 5 minutes. Mr. Yergin, last week's Wall Street Journal, there was an article titled, Can Gas Undo Nuclear Power? Discuss how low natural gas prices is problematic for our baseload energy production. And I'd like to know your thoughts on low gas prices as it impacts fuel diversity into the future and existing domestic resources like nuclear.
I think what's happened with natural gas prices, remember when people went out to start developing shale gas, the incentive was very great for these independents. It was like $12, and now we know we're talking around $3, and that is really changing the marketplace, the electric power marketplace for everything, certainly including nuclear. So
does that give you concerns for maybe the viability of nuclear in the future if this continues? And also, what do you think this is going to do? Do you think in 10 years, if you can magically look forward, that we'll have a diverse energy supply, or do you think we'll maybe be kind of too many eggs in one basket?
Well, I think it's we have 4 reactors that are under construction, 2 projects now. I think that in this cost environment, it's very hard to see anybody committing to a current generation of new power plants. The Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, the last session was partly devoted to small modular nuclear reactors, in other words, where there's a technological innovation. And I think the other question about our nuclear fleet is it's about 20% of our electricity. Lives have been extended. What happens after another 20 years, and does that shrink away then?
Yeah, and then another question. You mentioned my home state of Illinois as a state that already employs 39,000 people in oil and gas.
Well, who are benefiting from the unconventional oil and gas revolution.
Right.
Although that Illinois hasn't yet passed the regulation.
No, it's about time we get there. Yeah. But what would the economic impact be on Illinois if they allowed oil and gas production, in your mind?
Well,
as far as new.
It would be. It would lead to a considerable generation of income in the state, as we've seen in other states. Mr. Doyle mentioned it in his state, And when I was out in Illinois, that day the front page of USA Today was about how income is shifting, new income is being created in rural areas that have been depopulated and so forth because of this activity, and kind of in the center of the state. And
they're the areas that are frankly suffering sometimes the hardest under this recession,
yeah,
under this economic difficulty, we'll call it, to avoid argument on it.
Yeah, so the new Albany shale could be very important for the economy of your state.
And at what price do you think natural gas would need to be in order to for production to occur in Illinois?
Well, I think it's really, I think people are ready to go ahead. It depends upon what happens in Springfield, I think, as to whether it goes ahead or not, and at what speed.
I'll say Springfield makes Washington, D.C. look highly functional. So, okay. Well, thank you. And I think I appreciate everybody's testimony. I appreciate your answering my questions. The big concern here into the future is I've always been a believer in saying you can't have too few energy supplies. And when it comes specifically to nuclear, I think it's important we ensure nuclear maintain a major part of our energy portfolio, because in the future you never know how things change. But with that, I want to say thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
This time I recognize Mr. Pompeo for 5 minutes from Kansas.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank witnesses for that. It's been a long morning. I think I'm hitting cleanup today. A couple thoughts. It's been great to listen to. I've heard words like Renaissance and Revolution thrown around, and all the good things are happening. I think it's worth noting for everyone here, almost all of that happened with almost zero role of the federal government. Most of the things that the federal government's resources have gone to in this intervening period between this hearing in 2008 and the one in 2013 continue to provide a very, very negligible set of outputs important to the American economy. And so I think that suggests the direction of travel for us as well as we think about new policies. Mr. Yergin, I've got a question for you about pipelines. Mr. Shimkus talked about it a little bit. There's an article in Energy Daily talking about how long it's taking for permitting. I'd like to introduce that article into the record, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Study found that nearly 20% of natural gas pipelines have delays of over 6 months or more. Enormous capital at risk when you think about building a new pipeline. And it's important not only for existing fields to get those pipelines. The Mississippi Shale in my district is a good example. We've got production, but relatively little demand in towns like Anthony and Coldwater, Kansas. Got to get this product to the right places. I think there's also a circular effect. That is, if you know that you can efficiently build a pipeline, folks will go look for it in other places as well. Can you talk about the interplay between challenges in building pipelines and people's willingness to take risk in finding these fields in North America?
Well, Ms. Hutzler spoke about that before too. I think that getting the word she used, streamlining permitting for pipelines. I mean, it's kind of pipelines are literally a pretty straightforward thing, and that we ought to that you need them to keep up with where we are, and otherwise you either are using flaring for gas or you're shipping oil by truck and so forth, and that's not a very efficient way to do it.
I appreciate that. I'm working on some legislation to give FERC a little more authority in trying to streamline this process. I think it'll be bipartisan. I think we can do this in a way that provides all the protections for the environment, all the things we need to do, but getting us to a finish line where we actually make decisions about these. Whether the pipeline's a go or a no-go, we do it in a very much more timely and reliable fashion. We talked about energy exports. I was surprised Mr. Griffith didn't talk about coal exports. We've been talking about LNG mostly, but it's a broad set of energies that we ought to be exporting from America. Today, with respect to LNG exports, we have a delineation about DOE's authority, whether we're going to transport this to a free trade agreement country or a non-free trade agreement country. I guess this is for anyone on the panel. Is there any reason for that demarcation to continue to exist?
I think it's an artifact.
Yeah, that's my sense as well.
I mean, Japan, as the example I gave, is not a free trade country, and yet it's an incredibly important country to us.
It seems to me, too, that there's a history. I've read a little bit of the history of how it came to be, and it seems something that we as a policy matter could get rid of. We could direct those two places for shipment to be treated identically. I have a view of what DOE's authority ought to be. I don't think the national interest. I think the national interest finding is, by definition, it's free trade. It creates wealth in America. I think it's by definition, but I'm sure others would have a slightly different view on that. But at least we could get rid of that demarcation. Ms. Hutzler, I was reading an article about renewable energy, and In Eastern Europe, they subsidized it even longer than we have and even more than we have. And they have had some power blackouts. There's an article in Bloomberg on October 25th that I'd also like to submit for the record that talks about these energy blackouts.
That objection.
You know, our grid could suffer the same kind of things, in my view, if we have non-storable, non-reliable energy source. Do you have a view of the risk of us subsidizing this at such a rate that we get to a place where we've got less reliable electricity in America?
Yes, Germany is a good example because they're phasing out their nuclear units and turning to renewable energy in its place. But obviously, it has to be backed up, and it's caused instability to their grid. Neighboring countries are not allowing them to export their renewable energy, their wind energy, to them, such as Poland. And in fact, industrial users are seeing some disruptions in their service that's causing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in equipment. And they've already told the German government that either you fix this problem or we're going to leave.
Excellent. Got just 20 seconds. Mr. Szymanski, you talked about renewables growing at a huge rate. It's easy to grow at a huge rate off a small base. I remember I ran a small company at one point, too. Still not a hugely important part of our energy resource base. When you made these assumptions about its economic growth, what did you assume for federal policy? Did you can believe that we would continue our current, somebody on the other side, I called it creative financing. I'll call it getting in the pockets of taxpayers. But what assumptions did you make about state RPSs and these kinds of non-economic policies remaining in effect supporting renewable energy
EIA's
sources?
forecasts always use existing law and regulation. We don't try to forecast regulation or law. We do have the California renewable and other laws built into our forecasts. Renewables go from about 13% over the last few years to 16% of total electricity generation. So there's a lot of growth, but it's still a small portion.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, all, for being here today.
Congressman, I just want to add one other quick thing, if I might, Mr. Chairman.
It's okay with me. My time's up.
Your background in the oil service industry, a number of questions have come up here this morning about the impact of hydraulic fracturing and a need for water. In Pennsylvania, I know that most of the flowback water is now being recycled and used again. And changes in technology like the multi-stage fracturing could lead to much less water use simply because the identification of where to frack along a horizontal well could cut the number of feet that you have to frack in half. And all of these things, these changes in technology are taking place at such a rapid pace. It's one of the reasons why EIA's forecasts have fallen short, as Mr. Markey suggested.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, all time has expired, and I want to thank the panel of witnesses. We appreciate very much your, I'm sorry? Yeah, good hearing. So thank you all very much. We'll keep the record open for 10 days, and I'm asking unanimous consent to submit into the record a copy of a statement from the National Petroleum Council and also the executive summary of the IER study on opening federal lands to oil and gas leasing. So with that, we'll conclude today's hearing, and once again, appreciate the participation of everyone.
Mr. Doyle, I remember you said that you